Welcome, everyone. We are grateful for the presence of our guests and those who assist us at this moment. We'd like to thank the Centro Brasileiro de Análise e Planejamento, Cebrap, for having us and offer all the technical support. We are now starting the event, Producing Categories in the Right to Asylum, Juridical, Political, and Humanitarian Frameworks in Comparison between Nation-States. We are very happy to discuss these issues with researchers who are a reference in the field. This event is divided in two panels. The first one, which starts now, is called Frictions, Exclusion, and Agency through Bureaucratic and Juridical Categories of Asylum. There will be 20 minutes for each speaker. After the presentations, Miriam Alves will debate the three works and, at the end, we will open for questions. To open our event, I would like to call Paula Monteiro, full professor at the Department of Anthropology at the Universidade de São Paulo and researcher at Cebrap. She's the coordinator of the Núcleo Religiões no Mundo Contemporâneo that's organizing this event. Paula, please.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It is with a great pleasure that I open today's seminar about the national and international legal, political, and humanitarian frameworks involving refugees. This topic is still scarcely explored in Brazilian academy. In this sense, I hope this event will represent a significant contribution to the development of this field of studies in Brazil. This seminar is an initiative of Cebrap's research group Religions in the Contemporary World, to whom I thank for the support. I'm also grateful for Viola Castellanos and Helena Manfrenato's initiative and effort. This undertaking would not have happened without their seriousness and enthusiasm. I'm also thankful for the presence of our invited speakers who agreed to participate with us in this debate. Finally, I appreciate the availability and interest of the audience, whose participation is crucial to the progress of our thinking. The tense and complex relationship between religion and politics, or among different worldviews, is one critical issue that led us to the theme of migration and asylum. Viola and Elena, experts in those matters, are part of the Religion, Law, and Secularism project supported by FAPESP. This project has been developing a critical reflection on the consequence of contemporary religious activism on the significant themes that interest our democracy, such as humanitarianism and human rights. I'm sure that the expertise of our speakers, the various approaches, and the debate will make a fundamental contribution to clarifying this so elusive and complex issue. Thanks again to everyone. I wish you an inspiring journey. Thank you very much. Helena?
Oh, hi guys, sorry. I'm invisible for you. So sorry. Thank you so much, Paula. Now I give the floor to Natalia Corazza Padovani. She's a professor in the postgraduate programs in social sciences and social anthropology at Universidade Estadual de Campinas and a researcher at Pagu Gender Study Center. She's going to present a paper entitled Refugee as an Asylum for Expulsion, Foreigners Between Prison and Migration in São Paulo. Please, Natalia.
Okay. Hi, good morning. I would like to thank the organizers of the seminar for the invitation to participate, especially Elena and Viola. Also, I would like to thank Cebrap and the Núcleo Religiões, Mundo Contemporâneo. I would also like to thank Miriam Alves, Stefania Espada, and my dear friend, Angela Facundo, for the discussion and sharing of this first roundtable. It's a great joy to have the chance to present my field notes for these noteworthy researchers and partners. I would like also to highlight that this presentation is based on field study conducted between 2018 and 2019, and thus before the new coronavirus pandemic. I have worked as a researcher of prison studies since 2003. My work focuses on policies related to affections and gender that permeate strategies of survival and resistance in prison field, but also in neighborhood, markets, institutions, or on state borders, such as international airports, which are linked to prisons. Airports are border spaces where a significant portion of my interlocutors, foreign inmates in São Paulo and Brazilian inmates in Barcelona, were detained by Brazilian and Spanish federal policy. As Cynthia Lowe, Vinadas, and many other feminist authors teach us, state apparatuses are simultaneously produced and colonized at their margins. The margins are the imaginary contours that materialize that which Philip Abrams called the state as idea. This materialization takes place by means of the state system, as Abrams called it. In the articulation of the apparatuses of the state system that work for the idea of nation-state, migratory policies are implemented to define who are the subjects categorized as desirable and undesirable, that is, as migrants and foreigners. I was inspired by Giralda Seifer when I chose to use the category foreign women analytically, a category that is also repeatedly used in the empiric field. The terms foreign women live in prisons and foreign women prisoners are used by my interlocutors when they self-identify in contradiction to the discursive construction produced by NGOs and humanitarian agencies dedicated to defense of the rights of those people that these organizations conventionally call women migrants in conflict with the law. The results of my studies demonstrate that the category foreign women applies to the fact that laws referring to migratory mobilities, including the refugee law, do not contemplate population that cross transnational borders by means of drug markets and prisons. The population about which my ethnographic analysis focus are continuously located by foreignerisms, in Portuguese, estrangeirismos. Women who migrate through prisons are foreigners according to the laws and to the legal mechanisms of the state apparatus that govern national borders. This estrangeirismo can be expressed in the way that Rebecca, a South African, describes her situation. She said that she is document bipolar. Rebecca was arrested in São Paulo in 2009 and completed her sentence in 2012. Since then, she lives in a tenuous migratory regularity in Brazil through the emission of refugee protocols. She describes herself as document bipolar because, and I quote, "There are days that I am happy, believing that everything will be all right and that I will be able to stay in Brazil for the rest of my life. But the next day, I wake up and I think that everything is wrong. I am depressed, sad, scared. I think that I will never be able to attain residence here and that I can be deported at any time. I think that I am document bipolar." The sensation of bipolarity that Rebecca speaks of demonstrates that the use of the category foreign women should be considered not only because of how the expression appears in the ethnographic field, but because the legal estrangeirismos are fundamental to government practices that affect the lives and produce the social anguish felt by my interlocutors. When completing their sentences, women like Rebecca see in refugee status the only possible form of migratory regularization for them to remain in Brazil. The request for refugee status provide asylum from the repeated threat of deportation. This is because of people condemned for committing crime in Brazil are subject to two processes, a criminal one moved by the Federal Public Ministry and the administrative process of deportation issued by the Ministry of Justice. The Refugee Status Protocol is a document that suspends deportation proceedings, given that it cannot be conducted until the refugee status is completely judged by the National Committee for Refugees, CONARE. Deportation is a permanent element of Brazilian migration laws. Since the Statute of the Foreigner was promulgated during the military government in 1980 until the enactment of a new migration law in 2017, the legal measure of deportation have been maintained. Comparatively, in the text of the new migration law, there are more gaps for reversal of deportation than there were in the Statute of the Foreigner. Nevertheless, all of my interlocutors who are married in Brazil with Brazilian people maintain the request for refugee status active. After all, not even marriage automatically reverses deportation. Only maternity and paternity of Brazilians has effective weight in this regard. It should be said that Brazilian laws for deportation of foreigners accused of committing crimes in Brazil are significantly more severe than those in Spain, for example. In this regard, Eduardo Domenech makes an interesting description of how the legal category of expulsion historically supports migratory policies in South American countries. In terms of the interlocutors of the study that I have conducted, deportation has an impact both on the lives of the women who want to stay in Brazil after completing their sentences and on the lives of those who want to return to their homes or to their countries of origins. In the space of this presentation, there is not enough room to make the necessary considerations about the many meanings attached to the notion home and country of origin. But it is important to express that to be documented, is for this woman something directly related to the time of completing their sentence. Until the last day of a sentence under parole, my interlocutors have a right to hold banking and labor documents. At the end of the period of conditional liberty, which is a parole, that is, at the end of the portion of the sentence served outside the prison institution, these documents are no longer valid, given that they were linked to the condemnation and therefore a woman's mandatory presence in the country to complete her sentence. Between completion of the sentence and deportation by Brazilian state, there is a time gap. To remain documented during this space and time, the women who want to be deported and thus return to their country of origin also depend on the mechanism of the refugee protocol, because this allows them to have banking and labor documents. In this case, when deportation is finally decreed, it cannot be executed, given that refugee status overrides the deportation. The execution of deportation requires cancelling of the request for refugee status, which leads to a few more months of waiting for desired return home. For the objectives of our discussion, however, I will not present the case of someone who wants to return to their country, but of a woman who articulated a request for refugee status as a shelter from deportation. So she could stay in Brazil, which she considers her home. Joymar is from Philippines. She considers herself a masculine woman and is married with a woman who is also Philippine, who Joymar met while serving under conditional liberty in the city of São Paulo. Joymar's wife had never been arrested. She came to Brazil with a work contract to be a cleaner for a multinational company and had a permanent visa for Brazil. Joymar now works in São Paulo in a domestic services and is also a prominent person in the Association of Philippine Migrants in São Paulo and is one of the organizers of a beauty competition and of sporting activities for the organization. Joymar, however, came to Brazil through transnational drug sales. She was arrested at Guarulhos International Airport, the country's largest international hub just outside the city of São Paulo, and sentenced to prison, and could only receive documents through a request for refugee status. In 2019, Joymar's request for refugee status was being processed, and she was called for an interview with a CONARE agent. The interview is used to determine if the narrative and the trajectory of the person making the request is covered by the refugee law, that is, if the person suffers a risk to their life in their return to their country of origin, or if the person suffers from political or religious persecution or because of their ethnicity or sexuality. The refugee status also considers the history of the context of the person's country of origin. I highlight that Philippine women accused of international drug trafficking, even in a country other than Philippines, could have their life threatened upon returning to their country, given that Philippine law calls for the death penalty for people accused of drug trafficking anywhere in the world. This context, however, does not mean that Filipinos convicted of drug trafficking are considered refugees in Brazil. To the contrary, they are criminalized. Joymar appears not to clearly understand what refugee status means or its legal distinctions in relation to migratory status. As Angela Facundo teaches, there are few refugees or migrants who seem to clearly understand the subtleties that shape the subjects to be categorized under one or the other statute for authorization to remain in Brazil. And this is Joymar's situation. When she was called for the interview with CONARE agents, she asked that I go with her. On the day before, I called Joymar to explain all the possibilities under which she could have her refugee status recognized. I asked if she had suffered some type of persecution in the Philippines because of her sexuality, or for any other reason. Joymar stuck to her narrative that her life in the Philippines was peaceful, that she had a higher education in industrial engineering and had suffered a financial scam and lost all her property. Joymar also said that she was not afraid of the tough government policies for people accused of drug trafficking, and that she wanted to stay in Brazil because this is where she was married, where she worked, and also had a life that she enjoyed in the city of São Paulo. Joymar said that she only wanted the opportunity to travel to Philippines to see her sister. I tried to explain to her that this narrative would not allow her to be recognized as refugee, and therefore she would not receive a permanent visa to remain in Brazil. But Joymar maintained that the Brazilian government would see that she is a hard worker and would not stop her from staying in the country. It seemed that nothing that I said would change her mind. The next day at CONARE, Joymar asked that I accompany the interview as an interpreter of her statement. As an interpreter, I had to sign a confidential agreement that would quite clearly limit my ability to talk about, write, or narrate anything that had been said or took place in the interview room. The agreement also determined my responsibility to translate exactly what was said as faithfully as possible. The reason for the requirement for silence and the threat of a mistaken translation that the confidential agreement included became clear during the entire interview. When we left the interview room at CONARE, I was objectively and subjectively drained. The interview with Joymar had clearly not been sufficiently suitable for her to be categorized as a refugee. Joymar, however, was quite happy. She understood that this was one of the steps of her migratory process and that soon she could have documents that would allow her to live in Brazil and to visit her sister in the Philippines. I explained that the interview had not been exactly positive and that even if she was recognized as a refugee, she would have to wait even longer to obtain the documents that would allow her to live and enter Brazil without being stopped by the federal police as an irregular immigrant. Without understanding this, Joymar questioned me, saying that she had not even told the CONARE agent that in the Philippines she had been a community leader in her political party in the neighborhood where she lived because, and I quote, "I know that Brazilian government does not want leftist activists. So I did not say anything about this because I want to show them that I only want to stay in Brazil to work as a good immigrant." When she said this, Joymar provided me the information that I was trying to get from her for 2 days, consistent information that would be recognized by the refugee law. When I explained that she should not have omitted this information in the interview, she was quite confused and repeated that she did not understand how a country that does not want leftist activists in its territory who are Brazilians could give refugee status to a foreign leftist activist. I said that it was truly confusing, but that whatever may be CONARE's response to her request for refugee status, we could appeal. She became sad and nodded her head in agreement. We went to bus stop and each of us continued on a trajectory. In some way, we both returned home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia, for the great presentation. The next presentation will be given by Stefania Espada. She's a professor at the Department of Legal Sciences at Universidade de Bologna and research fellow at the Interdepartamental Center Alma Mater Research Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, with a paper entitled categoriological as an exclusionary device, the right to protection under the test of stereotypes and hetero-imposed narratives in Italy.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm here, but if I start the PowerPoint presentation, I can't see anything. It's normal? Maybe yes. Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, like, the important thing is that you can see the screen with the slides.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, I can see, but it's too hard to speak. So I try to not waste.
No,
so
but
much
I mean,
time.
like, if you share the presentation now,
Yeah.
then you don't see the presentation anymore, or you don't see yourself?
I don't see myself.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I try to.
Mhm.
I can't see anymore my presentation. I don't know why. Sorry.
Or, I mean, like, in alternative, maybe.
Yeah. Now, yes.
Okay.
Now, yes. I want to try to do this. So
Okay.
it's no, another trying. If I put this
Here, like,
full
now it's
screen,
working.
yeah, it's full screen, but I can't see anymore you. So you can read also if
Yeah, I mean, like, we
present
can read.
the.
Fine.
Okay, so thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to all. Thank you to Viola and Elena and Paula and all the organizer for the opportunity to be here with you today. It's a very great pleasure for me. And first of all, I apologize in advance for my English, but it's a very long time since I have been the opportunity to speak, so I will use the written notes. And also, I apologize for any stuttering, but it's a problem other in my mother tongue. So what I am going to present is the result of an ethnographic research on law and documents started 8 years ago and is still ongoing. Being aware that the aim of this seminar is to analyze how categories relate to the right to asylum works, it's important to remember that legal categories are fundamental to grant and recognize rights and protection in theory. So law works in this way. As an anthropologist, we know that naming means creating, and therefore that the creation of a category acts in several senses. It defines those allowing protection as a law, in theory, but at the same time creates merging borders, separates, keeps out, and excludes. From a juridical point of view, categories are not good or bad in themselves. It depends on how they are manipulated by politics and used in everyday life by bureaucracies. So we know that categories, in this sense, can become invisible device for performing violence and also death. So therefore, in order to understand how categories work in practice, it's necessary to investigate the normative context in which they are produced, and all about the ratio of the measure that should grant protection. So I know that there is no time to explain in detail the legislative structure of the procedure of recognition of international protection at European and Italian level. and how the right to international protection has been transposed. So in this slide, yeah, the next one. You can see this, the first slide.
Yeah, we can see the blue one.
I've tried to summarize as much as possible the long process of legal and political work. As you can see, the process has been protracted and is still ongoing, especially from the point of view of efficiency and achieving the objectives set by the principle that legitimize the regulatory perimeter of international protection, considered as a fundamental subjective right. And secondly, and is a generative point of legality, so it's very important from the point of view of legal sources, the obligation contained in all these regulations with different ranking are not derogable in theory for selfish reason or interest of individual member states. In theory, but also in practice from a legal point of view, the legitimacy of Europe itself is based on the principle of solidarity and reciprocity. So where do the problem arise? First of all, the European Union is supposed to have competence, jurisdiction for the right of asylum, but left it up the individual state to fill it in the gaps. The Union has therefore only provided more or less compulsory guidelines derived from the international law, the Geneva Convention. Secondly, and the problem arises here, the European member states have divergent interests determined by their special location. The country distant from the external borders have an interest in preventing the secondary movements of migrants people, while the countries at the external borders, like Italy, as countries of first entry and therefore for the Dublin regulation, are responsible for analyzing the application for protection and providing shelter, don't want to become a funnel and accuse Europe of having left them alone. So the Dublin regulation has been created this short circuit for 20 years, and we seem to be farther and farther away from a real ability to reforming it, to go beyond the problem of the country on the first entry, and the lack of willingness to operate relocation programs according to the logic of shared responsibility. Finally, a third aspect, namely how over the years there has been a criminalization of solidarity towards migrants, a real hostility towards the humanitarian also. So a kind of perfect storm in which the right to asylum is slowly being eroded at its core. With regard to the Italian context, two fundamental aspects should be pointed out. The system delay in transponding protection obligation, the first organic legislation on international protection dates back on 1998, and a constant reform process marked by a securitarian and exclusionary approach. The securitarian logic exploded in two moments, in 2009 and after in the 2015 migrant crisis in Europe. So it's important to underline that in 2015, Italy had just transposed the European guidelines. And then in 2017 and 2018, there were two important reforms that further restricted the protection of the right to asylum as a subjective right. So in 2020, there was a further reform, but it was unable to close the legal vacuum created by the previous reform. So it's important to remember that in theory, our constitution already refers to the right of asylum. But unfortunately, as we know, the principle contained in the charter are not always translated into a real enforceability of right. So I apologize for the oversimplification, but I thought it's appropriate to give a minimum of guidelines of the large context analyzed, because study the link between categories and right to protection require entries in this real legal labyrinth. And I admit that for me, as an anthropologist, it wasn't all easy to handle this complexity and also the ratio of the law. But I find very interesting to explore the short circuit contained both in the rules and the policies in implementing them. So from my study, I can answer if the right to international protection is real effective in Europe. So is strong, not just in paper, but also in practice. Again, since I cannot go into much in detail, I will try to answer this question using two images, one representing the law in the books and the other the law in practice. I believe, in fact, that image in this case have an evocative power and remedy the technical lack of knowledge and about the law dictated by our transnational space today. So the image on the left is how the common European asylum system speaks about itself. And it seems easy, easy journey. But on the right is the image in how it really works, and how this intention, indeed, how the normative international dictated by Geneva Convention is translated into the life of migrant and of migrant people and people seeking international protection in Europe, but in particular in Italy. So try to reach the heart of the problem, as Bargut said, from what was emerged from my research. We can see a problem of conflicting logics. And also the next slide with just image, because I think that are most evocative. They represent the reality of the labyrinth that we know today. So we know that in Geneva Convention that allows the right to international protection is a subjective right, which cannot be derogated on the basis or category and affiliation. And it's not theoretically subjected to a categorical logic. The principle of non-refoulement is the one that should guarantee this access without discrimination or predetermination. In the reality, the procedures developed over the last 30 years, and especially since the 2015 crisis, go in a completely different way. So we can, in fact, identify a problem with the divergent ratio. I try to summarize them. So in theory, asylum rights is fundamental and subjective, but in the reality, we have several space system device put in place or legitimized over the time in order to carry out pre-identification work. Hotspots, list of safe country, bilateral agreements between state of return, more or less forced. In many cases, we can speak in terms of deportation. About this practice, Italy has already been sanctioned from Europe with the Irsi case 10 years ago. Since the crisis triggered by the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, when these devices were used to bypass the duty of the states, Europe has pursued a foreign policy with status immediately outside Europe that is structured according to the logic of externalized border. Such the agreement with Turkey, ratified at European level in 2016, and the reproposal of the agreement with Libya made by Italy in 2017 and still in force today, despite the fact that we have incontrovertible evidence of torture, detention, inhuman and degrading treatment, even by the Libyan authorities themselves, and we pay them for do so. Cynically, we could say that these agreements just mentioned are at least public, can be contested in appropriate place, while the Balkan route, for example, is marked by a secret agreement between police that make more difficult to prove any violence or violation of fundamental right granted in theory to migrants and especially for applicants for international protection, resulting, for example, from the so-called practice of chain pushbacks, aimed to move migrants out of the external border of Europe and thus had the and to stop the ability to ask protection. In fact, the underlying logic is not to allow applicants for international protection to enter into European territory in order to avoid activating the safeguard and protection due to them. So, for example, the border procedure introduced in Italy in 2018, which became the main management mechanism in 2020 in European New Pact. In fact, it's important to say that the exclusionary logic promulgated by Italy, the territory where different migration routes by sea and land converge, seems to have been Europeanized. So instead of sanctioning the country like Italy, forming the external border of European Union for violation of fundamental rights, European management has integrated these securitarian and inhuman devices. So we can see solidarity between states only in avoidance of responsibility and legal obligation to which they would be bound. For example, the pre-screening procedures set by the nationality. One last thing must be taken into consideration before considering one of the most useful categories in recent years, namely the concept of vulnerability. All the European legislation concerning international protection has been harnessed to the logic of management of migratory flow. This approach foresaw the free movement of European citizens between member states and at the same time the closure of a external border. This is the plan from the beginning. Europe hypocrisy is becoming ever clearer. Freedom of movement concerns the citizen of the member state and it's subordinate to the closure of external border. Moreover, the selfish logic of the state is destroying the legitimacy principle of the union itself. Solidarity and reciprocity have never been implemented with regard to the management of migratory flow, including international protection. As the last 2020 New Pact makes clear, solidarity is mentioned, but it refers just between member states in avoiding protection or obligation. There is no mention of solidarity with regard to migrants, applicants for international protection, or states of origin. So just the last image on the right deserves to be translated. I don't know if you can understand Italian, because it tells exactly the inability of the current categories to really protect asylum seekers. So from Italy, they sent me back to my country in Africa because I'm an economic refugee, not a political one. Of course, we have, though, a 10 years crisis, corruption, no hospitals, disease that kill our children, people starving, Western companies exploiting us. How unfortunate if we don't have a civil war yet. So, how European states, including Italy, have managed to circumvent the obligation or protection, just using group logic of category in a exclusionary way. I believe that the concept of vulnerability is very useful to investigate the conflict of ratio, both within the Union and between the Union and the individual member states, and how, beyond the written rights, practice and device have been created aimed at non-recognition and therefore at circumventing the obligation of protection. From the international point of view, in an attempt to reduce the destructive power of this conflicting ratio, regulation and standard, United Nations High Commissioner of Refugee have started to talk about vulnerable people. The category of vulnerability has thus become a protection tool, a way to avoiding this effect of the logic of pre-identification, trying to guarantee a minimum standard able to protect the most fragile people. But reflecting on who and how the law consider and consequently recognize as a vulnerable subject in need of protection does not extinguish the ambiguities intrinsic in the concept of vulnerability, but instead exacerbate them. There is in fact an antinomy structuring the idea of vulnerability, the difficult integration between the universal individual logic and the group logic. That is, between we are all potentially vulnerable and only some groups are vulnerable. For the United Nations, I'm going to quote, vulnerability is more inclusive than being at risk of persecution or refoulement. Situation of vulnerability can arise from circumstances in a person's home country during the journey, after arrival, and their experience of the asylum or migration system itself. Therefore, it's true that the vulnerability of migrants should be considered by balancing in its internal dimension, so the personal condition, and its external dimension, so the condition dictated by the context, without trapping it in a momentum temporis and in a territorial grids. And it's also true that the group logic adopted in the identification tools risks both making invisible by dehistoricizing and naturalizing the social, political, and economical causes that produce it. If vulnerability can be a shield against expulsion by reinforcing the principle of non-refoulement, it can also represent a trap if it's understood just in its group dimension. This risk is amplified when considering temporality, For example, when vulnerability is recognized, as well as the place where violence and persecution and more generally violation of fundamental rights take place. So while at the international level, vulnerability is defined by the United Nations, I quote, a state of high exposure to certain risks combined with a reduced ability to protect or defend oneself against such risk and to cope with their negative consequences, does refer to an individual dimension. At European level, it refers to a group dimension, as mentioned earlier. It was explicitly mentioned for the first time in the 2010 Stockholm Programme, and the common European asylum system failed to overcome this ambiguity, and in a certain sense have reinforced it. Vulnerability, in fact, is mentioned in the so-called reception directive that provides a theoretically non-exhaustive list of persons who may need special reception and protection condition. So the problem is therefore that the vulnerability is only specifically mentioned in relation to the issue of the treatment in shelter and not in relation to the recognition phase. So, for example, in the hotspot, the performative categorical logic began to function ex ante, granting or not the possibility of formulating the request for international protection. This phase function in order to carry out a summary selection process. It was thus predominantly the 2015 hotspot approach that authorized, in a sort of domino, even more restrictive unilateral action by member states, making recognition of manifest and or potential vulnerability limited, if not impossible, to carry out. In recent years, therefore, instead of being considered as a vulnerable group in itself, applicants for protection have become dangerous people, and for this reason, they are generally denied. In fact, the request for international protection is things to be instrumental for the majority of people who apply for it. Think of the list of safe third countries and the procedure border of the new pact. In short, most of them are false refugees, not real ones, and we must reveal their deception. It's interesting to reflect on the inversion of imagery that has taken place in Italy, because it is an example of how legal categories are contaminated by stereotypes. Before the so-called refugee crisis, it was the economic migrant who was considered as integrable by virtue of his workforce, while the refugee was considered a sort of social parasite in need of everything, and therefore not functional but a burden, an economic burden for the country. And it's exactly this previous imagery that has turned into policies that are opposed to the law, pushing member states to close the border more and more. Following the crisis, the imagery has been completely overturned. Today, it's an economic migrant who are interpreted as an illegal migrants, since they do not run away from wars like the real refugees. This inversion is creating a real short circuit, first and foremost political and legal ones. The rhetoric of the necessary distinction between economic migrant and asylum seekers produces regimes of suspicion, and often transform the interview provided by the Territorial Commission, the authority in Italy competent to examine the application form, into real interrogation aimed at uncovering inconsistency and exposing lies. So reproducing inequalities and violation of fundamental rights. So the vulnerability emerges as an ontological, individual characteristic overloaded in a moral sense, where domain of vulnerability are created or operating in a essentialistic and restrictive sense. In conclusion, what continues to be recorded is that although some concept categories are created for overcome the exclusionary logic, but in practice they fail the target and they also become exclusionary too. In fact, the category of vulnerability itself is unilaterally predetermined and used, shaped within an asymmetrical power logic. The danger is to create a hierarchy of the more or less vulnerable and thus to want to measure the imponderable. So the category of vulnerability can be considered a product of the humanitarian paradigm, which wants to appear as fair. Instead, it becomes functional to the division between desirable and undesirable migrants. So is there any hope for the future? I don't know. But maybe from the European Court of Human Rights, there is a faint hope. The challenge of the seemingly insoluble dichotomy within the concept of vulnerability has been in fact taken up the European Court, which understands applicants for international protection as a, I quote, a particularly underprivileged and vulnerable population group in need of special protection. The court's attempt is therefore to overcome the restriction due to the application of essentialized facts and categories, strategically using the same group logic, but in a extensive sense. All applicants for international protection as a group should be recognized as vulnerable subjects to be granted appropriate procedural and reception guarantee. Within this group, there will be category of person who will present specificity to be granted further guarantee, trying to create a new level of standard of the minimum ethical. So, and it's the last slide. Sorry for I'm late. This image, I think I summarized very well, unfortunately, how opulent white justice is based on an unfair asymmetry of power, especially the power to produce legal categories. In conclusion, the right can be seen both as a poison and a cure for violation of fundamental rights, such as the right to asylum. To return to what I said at the beginning of the presentation, the categories are not in themselves bad, but represent the way to actually activate, to make enforceable rights. It all depends on where we start the process of categorical proliferation. To do so, it's useful to recall that the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the intrinsic value of every human, and that the dignity of each member of the human family, so we have to restart here, constitutes the basis of freedom, justice, peace in the world. In other words, the human family without any distinction or other category. So yeah, we still have a dream. So thank you for the attention. I hope I've been clear enough.
Thank you, Stefania. We now move on the last presentation given by Angela Facundo, adjunct professor at the Department of Anthropology and Postgraduate Program in Social Anthropology at the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte, nominated Unstable Categories and Bureaucratic Existential Experiences. Por favor, Angela.
Bom dia para todos e todas. Eu vou falar em português e gostaria de começar agradecendo, né, a todas as pessoas envolvidas na organização do seminário, parabenizar pela iniciativa ao Núcleo de Religiões no Mundo Contemporâneo, do Cebrap, e agradecer especialmente a Helena e Viola, que fizeram todos os esforços para que eu pudesse estar aqui com vocês hoje. E também gostaria, claro, de registrar um imenso prazer de estar na mesa com a minha querida amiga Natália, de ouvir a Stefania, compartilhar com ela, e ainda de contar com o debate também da querida Miriam, que a gente já está se encontrando faz um tempo nos caminhos da vida. Então, na minha intervenção de hoje, considerando a proposta do seminário, e talvez um público que esteja se relacionando com essas discussões, e outro que já tem experiência, eu pensei em frisar algumas ideias que já vêm sendo colocadas há tempos nos trabalhos de muitas pesquisadoras, dentro das quais eu me incluo. Se trata da necessidade de refletir sobre os processos de migração e, em um sentido mais amplo, sobre os processos de gestão das mobilidades, como campos etnográficos nos quais pesquisamos relações e interações entre agentes e agências e não necessariamente grupos fechados e contidos em fronteiras previamente definidas. Sempre vale a pena lembrar que essas interações se dão entre sujeitos que estão em posições assimétricas de poder na contenda global pelo direito à permanência na Terra. Nesse conjunto de interações, esse conjunto de pesquisadoras, né, pesquisadores, nos ocupamos das dinâmicas e experiências dos sujeitos migrantes na mobilidade, claro, mas também nos ocupamos das produções coletivas e subjetivas resultantes da sua relação com uma multiplicidade de atores que tentam regular esses movimentos em nome do Estado, né, que são coprodutores de categorias como refugiado climático, humanitário, solicitante, migrante econômico, residente em trânsito, e assim por diante. Quer dizer, que eu estou frisando que esse conjunto de pesquisas não toma as categorias como um dado a partir do qual se analisa a realidade social, mas toma a produção dessas categorias como objeto de estudo, né, sugerindo que elas fazem acontecer a realidade que pretendem administrar e que, além disso, elas marcam profundamente os processos de subjetivação das pessoas envolvidas. Então, quando falamos da fria e desprezível burocracia estatal, estamos falando também de emoções, moralidades, afetos, decisões existenciais profundas e vínculos que podem orientar as perspectivas de futuro das pessoas. Por isso que eu proponho falar em experiências burocrático-existenciais. As categorias e as classificações, em geral, são, por excelência, formas de gestão do Estado, formas de se fazer Estado, para que elas sejam férteis, quer dizer, para que elas produzam e reproduzam as fronteiras geopolíticas do Estado, mas também as fronteiras da nação, ou seja, a divisão entre o que é legal e o que é ilegal, a definição dos modelos adequados de família, parentesco, a cor, raça ou etnia almejada para a nação, os territórios ditos adequados para grupos de pessoas específicas, etc. Para tudo isso se faz necessária a participação dos sujeitos em diversos rituais burocráticos, às vezes de maneira forçada e violenta, e às vezes de forma desejosa e proativa. Ou seja, além de relações de opressão e dominação, não estamos falando apenas dessas relações, mas também de relações de autoridade, que se concretizam em espaços administrativos diversos e em encontros com um amplo leque de agentes. Embora a produção dessas categorias seja constante e se alimente de tradições administrativas de longa data, né, como proposto por alguns teóricos brasileiros, como Antônio Carlos de Souza Lima, elas não são categorias fixas e, pelo contrário, estão o tempo todo em mudança e mútua tensão. A definição do que seja um refugiado ou um migrante depende tanto da gramática política de uma época determinada e do escopo do projeto de nação que esteja em curso, quanto dos acontecimentos planetários que incluem guerras e outras formas de violências, né, como crises, entre aspas. A gente pode pensar melhor com projetos climáticos ambientais, mas a gente chama de crises climáticas, crises ambientais, crises sociopolíticas, político-econômicas. Mas também dependem das relações contextuais entre países de origem e de recepção. das negociações com agências humanitárias e da definição dos alvos das ações dessas agências, ou ainda das relações diplomático-econômicas entre os estados envolvidos, que incluem um projeto político também, às vezes para a região, às vezes para o mundo. Eu queria mencionar que nas suas pesquisas sobre os projetos de importação de mão de obra migrante branca europeia para o Brasil, por exemplo, a Giralda Seifert apontou o caráter racista e eugênico do Plano Nacional de Imigração do período pós-escravatura, mas, além disso, a autora alertou para a relação antagônica, mas mutuamente constitutiva, entre as motivações ditas econômicas e aquelas ditas de cunho político, como distinção importante para o controle desses movimentos. Isso, inclusive, para a época em que as categorias usadas nos planos nacionais de imigração não eram ainda as de refugiado e imigrante econômico, como é hoje, e sim as de emigrado por motivos políticos e colono. Então, eu cito brevemente a autora, num texto sobre os primeiros planos nacionais de imigração, em que ela fala: no Vale do Itajaí, por exemplo, alguns administradores acusaram os agenciadores do governo imperial de recrutar imigrantes de forma descuidada, permitindo o engajamento de revolucionários de 1848 e comunistas. Reivindicações e manifestações públicas de descontentamento, algumas resolvidas à força, deixaram em evidência o emigrado por motivos políticos, acusado de entrar no país disfarçado como agricultor, leia-se como imigrante econômico, né? Imigrante econômico. Em outros trabalhos, a autora vai mostrar que acusações parecidas se mantiveram durante as décadas posteriores, em que novos projetos de expansão da fronteira nacional foram se vinculando à importação de mão de obra, às diferentes facetas dos projetos de branqueamento e miscigenação nacional e à preocupação durante o Estado Novo com o caráter brasileiro das colônias, especialmente as de origem germânica, pesquisadas pela autora. Isso, claro, sem mencionar o projeto político anticomunista ou as restrições de ordem moral que atingiam mais severamente mulheres se deslocando SUS. Então, aqui eu gostaria de frisar que a desconfiança expressa contra os sujeitos migrantes no final do século XIX e no começo do XX consistia em que pessoas refugiadas, né, emigradas por motivos políticos, estariam entrando no país se passando por agricultoras, por migrantes econômicas. Ou seja, refugiados estariam se aproveitando dos planos de importação de imigrantes para entrar no país. Já nas últimas décadas do século XX, essa relação vai ser exatamente a inversa, né? Inclusive como foi exposto nas apresentações que me precederam. Ou seja, a acusação é da existência de imigrantes econômicos se fazendo passar por refugiados. E essa mudança não é apenas uma característica da situação do Brasil, e, de fato, vários autores no mundo fora têm apontado essa constante desconfiança sobre os falsos refugiados, entre aspas, como uma característica dos processos de reconhecimento, especialmente nos países ricos, a partir da década de 1990. Os falsos refugiados, ou seja, os migrantes econômicos, passam a ser acusados de serem aproveitadores da generosidade nacional para com as pessoas perseguidas pelas causas determinadas nas leis de refúgio, muitas dessas leis inspiradas, por sua vez, na Convenção de Genebra. De forma resumida, no Brasil, na época em que eu fiz a minha primeira pesquisa sobre a figura do refúgio, que foi o fim da primeira e o começo da segunda década do século XXI, essa leitura se mantinha ativa. O refugiado era aquele que não era um migrante econômico. Né? Na economia da paixão nacional, para usar o conceito de Sayage, dessa época, os esforços da maioria das agências e agentes do universo institucional do refúgio se orientavam à proteção e salvaguarda do próprio estatuto do refúgio. Né? Ele tinha que ser protegido, inclusive dos refugiados que poderiam esconder por trás de si um migrante econômico. O engano de um falso refugiado não somente poderia atingir o plano econômico nacional, mas causar um estrago moral na sociedade de acolhida, assim como o questionamento da eficácia dos agentes e das políticas encarregadas de selecionar as pessoas certas e manter a segurança nacional. Muitas das pessoas solicitantes ou refugiadas com as que conversei na época dessa primeira pesquisa tiveram que aprender a fragmentar narrativamente suas experiências para que a dimensão econômica das suas vidas não contaminasse o relato das experiências sociopolíticas. De fato, tiveram que omitir dados importantes da realidade dos seus lugares de origem, atingidos por processos violentos de controle paramilitar das economias locais na Colômbia, e, além disso, tiveram que fazê-lo com destreza para conseguir o reconhecimento. Outras pessoas, menos alfabetizadas nos rituais burocráticos ou no preenchimento de formulários, ou menos eloquentes ou convincentes na sua narrativa, ou menos conectadas com redes de refugiados que já tivessem passado pelo processo, foram rejeitadas ou enquadradas em outras categorias migratórias. E também estão, e eu acho que é muito importante fazer esse registro, os casos exemplares de refúgio, aqueles sobre os que não há dúvida sobre a necessidade de proteção. Esses casos servem para reforçar a existência da figura pura do refugiado, a que todos os outros devem se enquadrar. Na época da minha pesquisa, esses casos exemplares serviam também para legitimar, como proposto por Abrams, a sujeição politicamente organizada que permite receber em pequenas doses uma minúscula porção do enorme contingente planetário das pessoas em procura de novos locais para se estabelecer, mesmo que seja temporariamente, e apresentar essa ação como um grande gesto humanitário. Já naquela época, muitas críticas eram colocadas a essa distinção entre migrantes econômicos e refugiados. Questionamentos potentes começaram a emergir não apenas dos coletivos sociais migrantes e de grupos militantes e de pesquisadores e pesquisadoras, mas também da parte de muitas ONGs que faziam parte desse universo institucional do refúgio e que lidavam com o dia a dia da vida das pessoas, um cotidiano em que essa ficção de esferas separadas não se mantém por muito tempo. As agências internacionais, especialmente, mas não exclusivamente as ligadas ao sistema ONU, já vinham utilizando a categoria de fluxos mistos, não para reconhecer a mistura na vida cotidiana de economias de guerra e perseguições políticas, ou dos efeitos também políticos do projeto capitalista de desterritorialização de vastos contingentes de humanos e outras espécies no planeta, mas para dizer que migrantes econômicos podiam, às vezes, viajar junto com refugiados e vice-versa. Apesar das críticas, a distinção se manteve como pilar dos processos de reconhecimento de refúgio, inclusive dos programas de reassentamento solidário que eu pesquisei. Todos os núcleos familiares, que é o termo utilizado, reassentados, tinham o mesmo status migratório de refugiados. Seu reconhecimento prévio em outro país era indispensável para sua transferência para o Brasil. E no caso do refúgio por elegibilidade de pessoas provenientes da Colômbia, houve inclusive uma orientação para refinar os processos de reconhecimento e o cuidado nas entrevistas de seleção, argumentando uma suposta melhora nas condições do conflito na Colômbia. Então, como resultado, se deu uma notável diminuição no número de reconhecimento de colombianos. Outro fator que desempenhou também um papel importante nessa diminuição foi a entrada da Colômbia no Acordo de Residência e Livre Trânsito do Mercosul e triplicaram, então, os números de imigrantes de origem colombiana e caíram drasticamente os de refugiados e solicitantes, né? Muitos migrantes econômicos e pouquíssimos refugiados. Alguns anos depois, contudo, quando comecei as pesquisas com pessoas venezuelanas interiorizadas no Nordeste, com grupos indígenas guarau, a relação entre essas categorias tinha mudado e seu reposicionamento evidenciava novas tensões no campo da administração das mobilidades no país. Não que tenha desaparecido a preocupação com essa seleção que eu acabei de descrever, mas que novos elementos foram colocados em cena. Então, uma boa parte das famílias interiorizadas com as que eu tive contato, por exemplo, elas têm status migratórios diferentes. Há pessoas com permissões de residência temporária, no mesmo grupo, há pessoas solicitantes e há pessoas indocumentadas. Isso especialmente, por exemplo, nas famílias dos Guarau, né, do grupo indígena Guarau. Depois do reconhecimento coletivo da condição de refugiado, que fez o atual governo em 2019, há também, nos grupos familiares, algumas pessoas que já estão prestes a demandar, por exemplo, a residência temporária, residência permanente, junto com pessoas que já foram reconhecidas como refugiados, por exemplo. E nos postos de documentação na região norte, que estão vinculados à Operação Acolhida, a presença tanto do Acnur quanto da OIM, e, a princípio, toda a explicação de que tipo de documentação devem solicitar as pessoas é passada no local. Com essas informações, as pessoas poderiam, também em hipótese, fazer a eleição livre e informada de que tipo de documentação se corresponde melhor com suas condições migratórias e experiências prévias, né? A gente poderia também discutir muito em que consiste esse esclarecimento livre e informado. Enfim. Mas, na prática, para as pessoas com as que eu tenho conversado, essa eleição sobre os documentos vai depender, na verdade, por exemplo, de ter ou não algum tipo de documento de identidade venezuelano aceito como identidade no Brasil, pois, assim, em caso negativo, só resta, para quem não tem documento venezuelano aceito, só resta a opção da solicitação de refúgio, por exemplo. Essa opção também vai depender das informações, muitas vezes dos rumores que correm nos grupos de WhatsApp ou nos abrigos, sobre qual documentação vai sair mais rápido, sobre qual delas lhes daria acesso a mais benefícios sociais, ou inclusive de qual documento está saindo mais rápido no dia mesmo de fazer a fila para se documentar. Então, entre outros aspectos, né? E às vezes também esses aspectos incluem, por exemplo, o conselho de funcionários de ONGs que administram abrigos específicos, com financiamento também específico, né? Há vários elementos que podem ser considerados, eu acho, para pensar essa situação atual de mudança, ou pelo menos de retencionamento dessas categorias de migrante econômico e refugiado. Eu acho que, em primeiro lugar, claramente a gente tem que falar do número de solicitantes de refúgio no Brasil, que cresceu exponencialmente. Passamos de menos de 1.000 solicitações em 2010 para mais de 82 mil em 2019. E apesar do número total de refugiados no país continuar pequeno, se comparado com o tamanho da população brasileira, definitivamente a quantidade de pessoas que demandam uma solução ou que desestabilizam as que já estavam sendo oferecidas, termina pressionando a resposta do Estado, expondo sua precariedade e, não poucas vezes, as modificando. Antes da chegada maciça de pessoas oriundas da Venezuela, já tínhamos visto que a ativação de solicitações de refúgio, que se sabia que iam ser rejeitadas, foi usada como mecanismo para regularizar a entrada e presença em território nacional de outros grupos, como é o caso das pessoas vindas do Haiti. Essas medidas provisórias foram misturando os universos institucionais da migração e do refúgio e encontrando legitimidade nas ideias globais de algumas agências humanitárias que já pressionavam para reconhecer pessoas afetadas pelas crises climáticas ou pelos efeitos nefastos de grandes empreendimentos como refugiadas. Considero que outro elemento fundamental para o tensionamento da relação entre essas categorias foi a entrada da OIM no sistema ONU, que embaralhou, reacomodou a divisão de jurisdições entre as agências do Acnur e da OIM. Essa mudança, né, significa também a realocação de recursos financeiros, humanos e políticos, e essas consequências me parece que devem ser ainda mais bem estudadas. Por último, me parece importante também registrar o fato de que o governo brasileiro atual tem ativado a causal de grave e generalizada violação dos direitos humanos para conseguir um reconhecimento coletivo de refugiados. Um dos governos mais perversos em termos humanitários, usando um dos mecanismos mais elogiados no universo institucional do refúgio por seu caráter progressista e humanitário, o que também merece mais esforço de compreensão que a gente não tem tempo de fazer agora. Então, com essas considerações, e para finalizar, eu gostaria de insistir que as categorias das quais nós nos estamos ocupando nesse seminário não são meras traduções da realidade social, mas são parte de um dispositivo complexo que produz uma forma específica de entender a realidade, de administrá-la e de legitimar as respostas que são oferecidas para dito problema, né? Respostas que são enquadradas como respostas de Estado. Embora elas venham de antigas tradições administrativas, filosóficas e jurídicas, seus significados e relações são instáveis. E, ao mesmo tempo, queria insistir, para finalizar, em que tais classificações administrativas, que as pessoas têm que processar em meio a momentos vitais em que estão envolvidos grandes investimentos emocionais de tempo, bem como expectativas de futuro, têm um grande impacto nas suas vidas. As categorias jurídicas se traduzem em diferenças concretas e significativas ao tratarem de questões importantes para a existência, como a procura de emprego, oportunidades educacionais, de saúde, relacionamento com agentes e instituições de justiça, aquisição de bens, escolha de lugares para morar e para socializar, decisões sobre relacionamentos erótico-afetivos, de parentesco ou aliança, bem como sobre novos deslocamentos e seus destinos. Ou seja, insistir em que a coprodução dessas categorias em cenários e interações compartilhadas com agentes e agências são experiências burocrático-existenciais. Obrigada.
Muito obrigada, Ângela. At last, for the debate, I'd like to call Miriam Alves. She's an adjunct professor at the Department of Anthropology and at the graduate program in Justice and Security at Universidade Federal Fluminense. She's a researcher at the Núcleo de Estudos de Oriente Médio and the Instituto de Estudos Comparados em Administração Institucional at the same university. Miriam, please go ahead.
Well, I would like to thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful seminar. Thanks, Elena and Viola. It is such a great pleasure to be part of this. I'm glad to meet Angela, Natalia, and Stefania here. I really appreciate the presentation. I have learned a lot. I had so many insights, but for the sake of time, I will make my presentation short in order to hear more from Natalia, Stefania, and Angela as well. So I will present some questions, but before we jump into them, I would like to say that all presentations reaffirm the importance of looking critically at certain categories and define them. Firstly, Natalia presents such a powerful ideas through her ethnographical work. And the way Natalia describes the bipolarity and the struggle of Joema, her strategy in order to stay is so concrete. I guess Joema thinks all the time about the next move, like many migrants. She knows there is a process and there are steps involved. So she celebrated each step. Okay, she described herself as an economic migrant in an interview in a refugee process. Big mistake today, but she would be a wonderful colonel. But anyway, I can see her agency. That's my point. Her struggle to achieve what she wants. She wants to stay, so what's the next move? How to get there? Or in the case of Joema, how to stay? In the case of Joema, what she thinks, what do I need to do in order to stay? Having said that, I would like to hear more from you, Natalia, about the struggle of women like Joema or Rebecca, in order to stay or in order to go. There are some studies show, like you, the asylum application as a tool, as a mechanism. Maybe you can talk more about how bureaucracy is imposing or remaking life. And say remaking life, I think in Venadais, for sure. Her idea about the theoretical impulse is often to think agency in terms of escaping the ordinary, like she says, rather than as a descent into it. So my question is, does it take a lot of agency to deal with this bureaucratic process, don't you think? You also mentioned the WhatsApp groups, Angela as well, and Association of Migrants. Can you please throw more light on these ideas of migrants, help migrants, refugees, rush refugees. I guess there are a lot of agency here. However, I'm not only ask you to point out the agency, but also to think about power, because I guess the idea of agency is related to this friction, this tension. And my question is, why are the migrants organized themselves in this way? I guess there are a lot of things to learn from this answer. And what are the terms they are using and so on? Secondly, moving to Stefania's presentation. While I was listening to your presentation, Stefania, I thought a lot about Miriam Chiquitin's work. Some of her more recent work has considered innocence and containment as a moral concept that tend to structure Western discourse, Western political discourse. If you are false, if you are not a real vulnerable, if you are not innocent, in that sense, is one way that people claim to enact power by ignoring the privilege. But I want to say containment is one response to the idea of orders or contagious or so on. Like if you are not a, this vulnerable, you have this very strong idea, put them in prisons, deport them, put them in the camps, get them out of the political body, which they are going to contaminate if you accept, if you are not so, if you don't have this action. So as anthropologists, are you talking about purity, the idea of puro, don't you think? The other question is, well, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that dimension of the stereotype connection with exclusion. Now I will back to the questions for Angela. I have some questions for Angela, who I met when I didn't know anything about the refugee regimes in Brazil. At the end of 2015, we worked together at Fundação Casa de Rui Barbosa in a research center that doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed by a Brazilian policy that most explicitly demonstrates the government neglected and totally disinterested in the production of academic and scientific knowledge. But anyway, Angela's presentations clearly show how we should not be concerned with certain questions, such as the difference between a refugee and an economic migrant. The category we are dealing with in this seminar are not merely translations of social reality, but part of a complex device mechanism. These are your words, Angela. Having said that, the idea of power is very important in your speech. What do you think about the importance of ethnography to define the power? And now I'm going to turn to some of your early work, in particular your blog posting in the Refugee Outreach and Research Network, which I strongly recommend for reading. In this article, Angela, you show that these categories are better suited to explain the inequalities to the rights in the citizens linked with a state. The criterion of nationality, moreover, can lead us to take for granted or naturalize the very idea of nationhood. Could you talk more about the inequalities in Brazil related to nationalities, class, race, and ethnicity? And there is, I guess, a very strong impact especially for the Garal group. And last, but not least, I have 2 questions for everyone. All presentations identify what Miriam Chains calls an anti-politics of care. Consider that whatever humanitarians means, the practice we have and see on the ground are blended with militarism, deportation, incarceration, right? How do you define this context where the human rights language is used to stop people from getting into place? As I conclude, just allowing me recognize the honor to have the opportunity to discuss with you, and thank you so much.
Hi, sorry, it's just like a very short communication because we are a little bit over the scheduled time. We're going to extend this session of other 15 minutes so that everybody can reply to Miriam's questions. Thank you. And another thing, sorry, last thing. There will be another panel. The second panel will start in half an hour. So there's going to be just 15 minutes of pause between the first and the second.
It's me now. My dog is also speaking, so I'm so sorry for that. And I hope be able to answer I don't know if all, but maybe some questions and some amazing provocation made by Miriam. Thank you very much. And I also would like to thank Stefania for criticizing the vulnerability category. It's very important to think about how categories created by the grammar of humanitarianism are related to criminalization policies. And I think the same happens in the case of urban population management policies in Brazil, and I think maybe in Latin America as a whole. It's important so to highlight how vulnerability category has always been related to the notion of risk. And I think this is a question to us to make as anthropologists. Why we insist sometimes in using this kind of categories as analytical thought. In this sense, I think maybe the provocations that Miriam made me can be considered related to how the idea of vulnerability invisibilize agencies and power relations in a complex manner. And I always inspired by Chandra Mohanty's provocations in Under Western Eyes of how we sometimes just cannot see other ways that are created in a creative manner by our interlocutors. So I think for sure, Joemar categorized herself as an economic migrant in the interview was much better than be a leftist or a sexuality refugee, because she was clearly seeing the scenario that Brazil is now living in a political thought, this context of Brazil. So it was a kind of agency. And of course, to be a refugee, to demand the refugee is also a manner of agency. And it's also a manner of create new other forms to stay in Brazil and to create relations. And these relations, I think in the Philippine case, more than South African women, they create a really intense political organization themselves, which mixed all the categories that state are trying to separate. So women who are in jail are married with women who are economic migrant with a visa of permanence here in Brazil, but also women who are refugee in a classic consideration, as Angela told us. So and they create these associations, and I think it's really beautiful because in this case the agents pass through happiness and leisure and to create spaces of be happy in the margins of the mobility regimes. So I don't know if I answered you, Miriam, but I think we can also continue our conversation. But it was a great thing to be here and to hear Angela and Stefania. Thank you very, very much.
So the next person to reply, okay, Stefania, go ahead.
Okay, I don't know if the was the line of the presentation or the answer. So thank you for this conversation. Is very interesting. So yeah, is exactly a problem of guilt. I think in the Western view, migration is a guilt and becomes a mechanism of contagion. All the categories linked to status recognition are constructed from the idea of guilt, of the sin. Always, in theory, we grant protection to those escape from a war, but all the other conditions that would compromise dignity, for example, and therefore deserve protection, are not taken into account. So it is like we are saying, we recognize you, but you can prove, according to our logic, that you have been forced, that you are here not for your will. And at this level, stereotypes have an enormous power, because in our policies, that there are these policies create violation, but through the stereotypes of the other. So we avoid our accountability to understand that it's our action from a global perspective that determine inhuman condition. So the real push factor of migration. So recognizing migrants and asylum seeker as people to whom it's obligatory to grant recognition of rights would imply fully recognize them as human. But in the West, as you know, we still have to deal with our colonial past. So I think it's whole linked. And now we have just started to maybe understand how our idea and also our rights, universal rights, are good, but maybe they are not good enough, because we have a structural mechanism of dehumanization of the other. So we have a big work to do from the cultural level, historic history, the colonial past, because it's whole linked. And we can see also considering the nationality that are more according status. And yeah, we have a line color problem, and we have to restart to speak in white and black color in our mind for just to set the credibility of the person, of the migrants. So yeah, it's a gift. So, and it's connected also to the purity. I don't know if I answered to the question, but there are a lot of things in my mind at the moment. So thank you to all.
Bom, então eu agradeço também, Miriam. Eu sempre gosto muito do debate, das perguntas que a Miriam faz. Realmente, no pouco tempo, né, para dar espaço para o seguinte painel, eu não vou conseguir responder tudo, mas eu queria falar pelo menos duas coisinhas sobre as duas perguntas. Né? A primeira sobre a etnografia. Então, a etnografia é a forma em que eu sei fazer as coisas. Deve ter outras formas muito boas também de chegar a pensar de forma crítica, analítica, categorias, mas é a forma que eu fui treinada. Né? Então, uma defesa acirrada da etnografia, mas com uma ressalva, né? Que não é apenas uma etnografia de grupos culturais fechados, ou de grupos nacionais fechados. Né? Uma etnografia das interações entre grupos, entre agências, e o que a gente chama também uma preocupação por pensar esses processos de Estado, pensar criticamente, porque a razão de Estado tomou conta das nossas vidas inteiras, né? Até para definir o que é família, muito mais para definir o que é um cidadão. Então, eu acho que essa proposta etnográfica, ela permite, por exemplo, que a gente entre no campo super assim, desconfortável de criticar o que é bom, né? A bondade das pessoas, os programas humanitários, inclusive isso, a bondade politicamente organizada como transnacional ao redor do mundo. Então, nesses tempos macabros, é muito difícil você falar que a solução do refúgio, que é uma solução para muitas pessoas, ela apresenta problemas sérios nessa razão de Estado. Né? É muito complicado falar isso, cada vez mais complicado. Mas a gente também não pode, por conta desses desafios políticos, pensar, então, que esse mecanismo que legitima e filtra, né? A gente está falando de menos de 2% das pessoas deslocadas no mundo que conseguem entrar nas relações burocráticas dos Estados nacionais. O resto está por aí, né? Então, a gente tem que fazer esse esforço, eu acho, né, de pensar também que essa desprezível e fria burocracia, ela está cheia de dados etnográficos que permitem que a gente enxergue essa resposta e essa legitimação da resposta de uma forma diferente. Né? Então, essa seria uma pincelada para te responder a primeira pergunta. A segunda é bem mais complicada, né, porque eu acho que é um debate muito longo. Eu até escrevi, era para ter saído sobre o assunto, por exemplo, diferenciando a experiência de imigrantes, de refugiados, na verdade, colombianos, quando eles são negros do que quando eles são brancos, né? E eu acho que isso é interessante de ser discutido com muito mais cuidado. Mas o que eu queria frisar é que quem pesquisa sobre Estado, nação, e especialmente, por exemplo, na proposta da Butler, o que ela propõe é que comumente, e a Mal que também faz isso, né? O refugiado é pensado como um ser num estado metafísico de abandono, né? Ele saiu do seu estado, chegou para um lugar liminar em que não existe o poder do Estado e ele é restituído para o poder do Estado quando ele entra na outra realidade nacional. Né? Então, isso não existe. O poder do Estado não é a mesma coisa do que suas leis, fala ela, e além do mais, os poderes que fazem com que um ser humano seja expulsável, eles são poderes que permanecem, são poderes de raça, são poderes de gênero, são poderes que diferenciam o urbano do rural. Então, todas essas marcações nas experiências dos sujeitos que fazem deles sujeitos expulsáveis, elas se mantêm o tempo todo, elas não desaparecem no momento em que eles saem do país de origem, e muito menos vão desaparecer quando eles e chega num outro país, né? E no caso específico do Brasil, a gente tem um país, assim, umas políticas nacionais orientadas e informadas pela raça. E o racismo é um racismo institucional desde o Brasil Império, muito antes, né? Desde o Brasil Colônia até os dias de hoje. Então, desde coisas muito simples, né, como pensar, por exemplo, por que haitianos e venezuelanos, muito mais haitianos do que venezuelanos, são um problema nacional, e não os números, por exemplo, muito superiores de imigrantes europeus, até essas coisas simples que a gente denuncia nas redes sociais, por exemplo, até pensar os mecanismos específicos através dos quais se produz a verdade do sujeito, lendo a nação da qual eles vêm, né? Então, a nacionalidade não pode ser o único critério para pensar a desigualdade, pelo que eu venho de falar, mas também ela é um dado importante na geopolítica internacional, né? Cada sujeito também carga, entre outras marcas, a marca da nacionalidade, que é constitutiva, né, da sua experiência. Mas, enfim, é bem complicado, eu tentei fazer a resposta muito rapidamente para deixar o tempo para os outros colegas.
Bom, agora eu acho que a gente pode finalizar essa mesa, porque os próximos palestrantes precisam fazer os testes de imagem e som também, e eu espero vê-las agora no segundo painel. Agradeço muito a presença. Primeiro, agradeço por vocês terem aceitado o nosso convite ao nosso primeiro evento organizado. Meu e da Viola, digo, dentro do grupo. E foi um prazer ouvir vocês, espero que esse trabalho frutifique mais. E vamos agora para a segunda parte da mesa. Desculpa responder em português, gente, meu inglês tem alguns limites.
Tudo bem, Helena. So we're just gonna take a 15 minute break, and then we're gonna do the second panel. And so thank you, everyone. It was a wonderful conversation. We hope to continue to have it like in the second part. And we will continue anyway this conversation also in other occasions, hopefully, because I think like one of the most important, at least for us, goals of this seminar was to create connection between scholars that maybe don't usually interact so much with each other. And so we're very happy to have this opportunity and to create this kind of discussion. So see you later in 15 minutes. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the seminar, Producing Categories in the Right to Asylum, Juridical, Political, and Humanitarian Frameworks in Comparison between Nation States. Now, we will start with the second panel, which is titled Transformation and Afterlives of Humanitarianisms in Different Nation States. And I will give the floor immediately to our first speaker, Leonardo Schiocchet. Leonardo is a researcher at the Austrian Academy of Science. He will present the paper Tutelage and Humanitarian Reason. Leonardo, the floor is yours. You have to unmute the microphone.
Okay. Thank you very much, Viola and Elena, for this invitation. And I hope that my connection is not going to be dropped. I'm here in Beirut, and if you have been following politics, you know that there's no electricity in the country, and the situation is kind of crazy. So I hope that we're going to have an energy until the end. And I was saying on the backstage there that I'm going to have to leave after. So I don't know if you want to organize questions before the others, so however you want to deal with that, but I'm not going to be able to stay until the end of the session, unfortunately. So in what follows, I will examine engagements between nation states and refugees based in various ethnographies I have conducted among Arab forced migrants since 2005. I argue for the usefulness of the term tutelage to characterize mechanisms embedded into refugee regimes that to a great extent resonate with Elena Feldman and Miriam Tichtin, Didier Fassin, Lisa Malki, and Michel Agier's analysis of the humanitarian intervention and or the humanitarian reason. The concept of tutelage lays bare relations of power constitutive of the social situations I analyze. A subject or population under tutelage is considered not to have the full capacity to make its own decisions and is governed by another party that acts as its benefactor. Insofar as refugees do not decide their own fate and do not participate in shaping the policies affecting them, they are by definition under tutelage. Yet, this concept has been only rarely applied to the anthropological understanding of refugees, and more often to the study of indigenous minorities or international legal regimes over given territories and their populations. Tutelage embodies the power relations at play between refugees on one side and the national humanitarian order of the world on the other, and has often hampered refugee agency. In denying agency and full political participation and autonomy, tutelage objectifies and depoliticizes the refugees under its grasp. To illustrate the usefulness of the term, my presentation starts by briefly describing a few fieldwork situations of mine. I conduct fieldwork among Palestinian refugees in Lebanon since 2006, having dedicated most of my time to two refugee camps in particular between 2006 and 2009, Al-Jalil in the Bekaa Valley, close to the Syrian border, and the Bayye in Mount Lebanon. The trajectories I followed them then and still follow showed me that refugees from both camps had very little to no success in participating in the decision-making process relating to their situation. First, they all wanted to return to their villages of origin, which for most in Al-Jalil was Lubieh, and for most in the Bayye was Al-Bassa, both villages in Galilee, thus in what had become Israel. Until today, more than 70 years after their expulsion, the regional refugees and their descendants cannot return to these villages, nor can they decide much of their fate elsewhere. They have never been interlocutors in the plans that define their condition, and their limited agency has been almost entirely a result of their resistance to decisions imposed on them by international institutions and national governments. An overwhelming majority of these refugees did not have right to citizenship in Lebanon. Because they are stateless, they do not have passports, but only travel documents issued by the Lebanese government that severely restrict their movement outside and rights inside of Lebanon. They're barred from most employment and cannot legally hold property either. Moreover, I have followed many efforts by NGOs and other international organizations to improve life in the camps. Very few of them actually departed from the refugees' own considerations of what was important for them, rather than imposing their own will. For example, an Italian organization wanted to build a sports facility in the Bayye, despite the refugees' strong effort to use the funds to construct a school in the camp. In the end, there was no agreement and nothing was built. During my fieldwork from 2010 to 2011, among a group of originally a little more than 100 Palestinian refugees from Iraq who were resettled in Brazil following the fall of Saddam Hussein, I found a similar pattern. Almost all of them came directly from Ruwayshah refugee camp in Jordan. The UNHCR organized a screening process when representatives of different countries selected which refugees they would accept, giving the UNHCR the imminent plan to dismantle the camp and ideally permanently resettle its refugees inhabitants. While the USA, Sweden, and other countries took most of Ruwayshah refugees, including Iraqis of all religions and Arab and of Arab and Kurdish ethnic backgrounds, a group of Palestinian refugees living in Iraq prior to the conflict was rejected by all countries participating in the screening process. Most of them had already been born in Iraq and were prevented from moving to their villages of origin in what was once Palestine, or to move to the Palestinian Authority-controlled territories. Finally, in 2007, Chile and Brazil struck a deal with the UNHCR and took the remaining refugees, who could not decide on their own if they had wanted to go, or even if they wanted to go, or wherever they wanted to go. So those who went to Brazil were promised immediate citizenship, which did not happen to most of them, apart from those who bore children in Brazilian territory. They had to prove being duly integrated in order to be granted Brazilian citizenship, a process that could take up to 10 years. What integration meant was not clear at all to them, and many had their applications rejected over and over again. Most were unable to secure steady jobs in Brazil and pay for rent, especially the most senior refugees, some of whom did not have family support there. Few of them even wanted, but were prevented from being sent back to Iraq or to another country where they had relatives. Most complained of not having had any agency in deciding where they would go, or even where they could go once in Brazil, or what they could do. Many of those who were barred from working in their fields, since their certificates were not accepted by the Brazilian government. One of them, for example, a professor in Baghdad with a PhD diploma, was working as a security guard in a small shop in the south of Brazil owned by a Palestinian. Another one tied himself naked to the pole of the Brazilian flag in front of the Congress in Brasilia, demanded being sent away from the country to no avail. One of these refugees in Brazil was the aunt of a Palestinian refugee interlocutor from Al Jalil refugee camp in Lebanon. She and her husband were trying to move to Denmark through family reunification, which eventually happened after years of trying. I met her nephew in Aarhus, Denmark, where I also conducted field work among Palestinians who were granted citizenship more than a decade earlier. Unlike what had happened to those in Lebanon or in Brazil, these Palestinians had moved to Denmark on their own accord and effort. However, despite their Danish citizenship, they were being prevented from bringing family to Denmark due to increasingly restricting Danish migration laws. Most Palestinians in Aarhus were living in a government development called Gellerudparken and working on a large shed called Bazaar Vest, which had been constructed by the Danish authorities to improve life in the neighborhood, known in Denmark as Wild West or Wild West, in an allusion to the bazaar. While the Danish authorities, and especially the city of Aarhus, tried to improve their lives, in 2011 they were in the process of dismantling what they saw as a dangerous ghetto to promote integration. Integration in this context meant to directly interfere in community life by, for example, sending the local Muslim children to schools in different neighborhoods and closing the community swimming pool due to the way Muslim women were using it. Besides, the whole area of Gellerudparken was to be gentrified and transformed into a more mixed area, which would drive many of the Muslim inhabitants away due to the increased prices and curbing their socialization dynamics. In addition, families whose children were involved in crimes, whatever the crime, would lose their lease contracts. The Muslim community, which was largely composed of the Palestinians who once moved there, especially in the 1980s, as well as of Kurds from different countries, Somalis, and others, had insistently complained that they did not have agency and that these decisions were imposed top-bottom. My work on Palestinian, Syrian, and Iraqi forced migrants in Austria also pointed to a similar pattern. While reception of refugees in the Syrian conflict in Austria had been felt by the refugees as welcoming in 2015 and 16, recent government policies have turned the tables, and this initial reception has been increasingly waned as forced migrants face increasing difficulties to live in Austria. Once more, governmental policies have been largely based on the ideal goal of integration, and once more, forced migrants have been left out of the process shaping these policies, or even in conceptualizing what integration means in practice. Refugees and asylum seekers of all the conflicts have had a much less positive outlook on the Austrian government policies, starting from the fact that their acceptance as refugees in this country are diametrically opposed as those of refugees from the Syrian conflict. Most Iraqis and Afghans, for example, have their refugee status denied based on the assumption that Iraq and Afghanistan are safe countries. As it is for Brazil and Denmark, integration is a concept mobilized by the Austrian government to define migration policies not solely related to entrance in the country, but to regulate permanence. Most importantly, not only it informally regulate official statuses, but also overtly regulate public perception. While integration policies claim to stem out of a dialogue between the parts involved, they're actually contractual clauses with both official bold lines and tacit undertones, based on the idea of meritocracy defined solely by the host and legitimized by the principle of national sovereignty. But integration is only one of the mechanisms involved in refugee regimes, more salient in some cases, for example, Brazil, Denmark, and Austria, and less salient in others, for example, Lebanon, and defined by tutelage. One of the most characteristic elements of encounters involved forced migrants is their tendency to sharp asymmetry. Much have been written about refugee regimes and agency, and on how humanitarianism often acts as counterpart to nation-state sovereignty. Yet, very few name the relationship between what I call the national humanitarian world order, a development of Lisa Malki's national order of things, and forced migrants according to what defines the actor's space of agency, tutelage. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, tutelage means an act or action of guarding or protecting, the state of being under a guardian or tutor, the right of power of a tutor over a pupil, dependence, a determining influence exerted over an individual by a person, school, or movement. That is, under tutelage, a subject or population is considered not to have full capacity to make its own decisions and is governed by another party that acts as its benefactor. Supported by liberal principles or not, tutelage exists as much in liberal democratic societies as it does in other forms of political organization. Insofar as refugees do not decide their own fate and do not participate in shaping the policies affecting them, they are by definition under tutelage. And tutelage exists as much in liberal democratic societies as it does in other forms of political organization, as I just said. So, however, as mentioned from the outset, the concept of tutelage has been only rarely applied to anthropological understanding of refugees. In a rare passage on the governance of foreign-born minorities and non-citizens, David Reef writes, "For all that divides them, dyed-in-wool imperialists and contemporary advocates of state humanitarianism share something of the same faith that a combination of high moral intent, military force, and the imposition of good government and benign tutelage could be a force for the betterment of humanity." As this passage corroborates, the shortcomings of humanitarianism and humanitarian tutelage are hardly ever problematized beyond accepted consensus. Tutelage assumes the refugees' temporary incapacity to govern their lives on their own, evoking the transfer of biopower, that means power over subjects' lives, from the refugees to the UN and or host state. Tutelage is supposed to be temporary, often ending upon complete integration in the case of resettlement, for example, and is thus a counterpart to integration. While integration mobilizes a mythical ideological view of the host nation, tutelage mobilizes a bureaucratic regulatory apparatus in line with that view. Another promising model that scholars have recently mobilized that could flesh out power relations involved in the humanitarian intervention is Marcel Maus's concept of the gift economy. However outstanding when applied to a variety of social situations, this model has few serious limitations when applied to the understanding of humanitarian intervention on refugees. The gift economy is characterized by three phases: giving, receiving, and reciprocation. As opposed to the capitalistic logic, giving is preferable to receiving, and accumulating is perceived as hoarding, leading to catastrophic social results. Since the act of giving must be reciprocated with a gift perceived at least as valuable as the one received, during the time between giving and receiving reciprocation, the giver's moral status and thus social standing is elevated, generating or deepening hierarchy. This power relation cannot be simply avoided, since much like a birthday present, a gift in this type of economy can hardly be refused, for that would mean a refusal of the relationship expressed through the gift. In this economy, the same gift circulates season after season, jumping from individual to individual, Each of these gifts is said to have a spirit, a how. The longer the gift is in circulation, the higher status its spirit acquires. Thus, this type of moral economy presupposes a circuit that connects different parts of a society or different societies through reciprocity. The whole arrangement can only happen because subjects alternate their roles in the system. Many apply this concept more directly to the humanitarian intervention, and a few of them emphasize power relations. While power was not the main highlight of most famous essay, it was certainly accounted for in his model, and most of the scholarship emerging out of this essay in one way or another was interested in power relations. More importantly, I understand the gift economy described by Moos as essentially different than the relationship established through humanitarian intervention, particularly because reciprocity is severely limited or altered in humanitarian intervention, defined here as prompted either by the UN, international NGOs, or state actors, both host and donors. First, in the cases where the receiver of the gift directly reciprocates, reciprocation is not reciprocated in kind, given the social symmetry between the parties. That is, while refugees may in rare but significant cases become donors, the humanitarian apparatus is not the same as refugees, and refugee aid is never intended to be reciprocated in kind. In fact, it is the acknowledged asymmetry between the parts that prompts the humanitarian apparatus to give in the first place. The well-being of the refugee in principle being that which brings symmetry, social justice, into the system. Second, reciprocation is usually thought of as redirected to a third subject besides humanitarian intervention, and the refugee who receives aid following the motto, "We will help you so you can help others." In both cases, as Barbara Harabond correctly states, the system creates eternal givers and eternal receivers, as opposed to fostering the generalized exchange and alternate social roles characteristic of the gift economy model. In sum, the principle of the system resembles that of charity, and charity and the gift economy are far from being the same, despite how popular Moses' model became among anthropologists working on humanitarianism and on forced migration. So what is at stake here is both the principle of humanitarian intervention and the power relations they convey, what we understand as humanity and humane, and how we organize society around it. And so, as I have argued throughout this presentation, the relationship between the two can in fact be surprisingly contradictory. Tutelage, as opposed to the gift economy, lays bare relations of power constitutive of the social relation. Tutelage is what Malky and Foucault combined would call a technology of biopower, meaning power over life through which power is exerted asymmetrically across the system of forces at play. Tutelary regimes legitimate the dependency of protectorates, children, indigenous groups, national minorities, refugees, and other subjects perceived as not apt for deciding for themselves. In denying agency and full political participation and autonomy, tutelage objectifies and depoliticizes, much like a gun ban claims the state of exception does. So to conclude, in the case I presented, tutelage assumed the refugees' temporary incapacity to govern their lives on their own, evoking the transfer of biopower from the refugees to the UN and then to nation states. But if integration, however defined, is the desired result of refugee policies, then participative refugee policies should not only be a goal, but an unavoidable means to achieve that end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leonardo, for your fascinating presentation. So in order to accommodate the fact that you don't have so much availability with your connection, I'm going to anticipate, Roberta is going to anticipate the questions to you. So I'm briefly will present Roberta Altin. She is coordinator at the Centro Interdipartimentale su Migrazione e Cooperazione allo Sviluppo Sostenibile, an associate professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Trieste. So Roberta, she's the discussant for this panel, and she's gonna ask
I'm glad we are neighbors, Roberta. We have to talk later. Based in Vienna.
Thank you. Thank you, Viola, for this kind invitation. Thank you, Leonardo, for your very rich presentation. I must be very shortly because you don't have a connection. So I want to ask you directly, because you really describe very well this humanitarian reason, and for me it's really interesting that you try to compare in different nations. So we have this typical situation of the camp, in the southern usually of the world, but in this case we have the spread of this camp, no, also into Europe or in the border areas. So, and you well described. I don't have any comment because you are really well described the situation of passivity and the construction of this category, starting from the concept of forced migration and the application in different processes, and how is the end of this process. So my question is, do you think that we as a researcher and in search of new tools for analysis, we have to construct this idea of forced migration? And I'm thinking specifically to the process of migration toward Europe, because you know that after the so-called migrant crisis, we have the disappearing of migration for economic crisis. So, as a researcher, most of the time we support this idea that forced migration is good because they need to protection, they have the right to asylum, and this is a part of, Geneva Convention, this kind of thing. But as a researcher, because we are in search of new categories, don't you think that maybe we have to deconstruct this idea of forced migration? This is the first question. And the second is, in your long and very rich experience, don't you have to share with us different situation, specifically when the migrants were able to create a space between the humanitarian regime, the camp, the rigid assistential, and other not so regular, but could be seen as a way to be active and with agency? Sorry for the short question.
No. Can I answer, Viola?
Sure.
Yes,
So,
please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roberta. Those are great questions indeed. And, the first one is the eternal question. Is there a difference between forced migration and emigration that is not forced, as in people who feel pushed, motivated to move, aren't they also feeling forced in a sense? So this has always been, let's not say always, but let's say at least in the last couple of decades or so, has been a very important debate. In the let's say in both fields, because those fields are more or less, say, tangential to each other, the field of forced migration and the field of migration, but they have different literatures, they have very often different debates, they have different topics, and so on and so forth. And so this is the first thing that I think it's important for us to separate. And then there is the legal question that Roberta clearly puts out, that definitely is the most important question out there, which is we need. So what I'm trying to say is this: yes, we have to separate. It's a very hard thing to deal with, because we have to try to understand, first of all, empirically what we're seeing. Then we have to try to translate that into academic categories that are in debate with different kinds of literature, different bodies of literature, as scholars, and we need to address one and the other. And yeah, there were ways of people unifying those, but you lose a lot if you just simply annihilate the whole story and you just say that, well, there's just forced migration, that's it. Because in practice, one cannot, but at least I cannot just forget the idea that if somebody is fleeing from poverty in Bulgaria, it's not exactly the same as somebody who is fleeing from rape and from mines and from being killed in Iraq or in Afghanistan. It's not exactly the same. But the question is that I think that a lot of people get lost still, not only in anthropology, but in social science in general, and in forced migration studies and in migration studies in general, because that's it's not because they're unable to find, let's say, this distinction as a matter of kind. They find the distinction as a matter of, or let's say, gender, and the distinction is a matter of intensity, so to say. Yes, but that's precisely the point. The point is that we have to create academic instruments that allow us to deal with intensity of knowledge, not only the different kinds of process that we're seeing. And so this is, I think that's one reason, maybe we can change the terms, but I think that we still need to differentiate between somebody who's fleeing terror and somebody who's fleeing poverty, for example. And not only on the legal side, but on the academic side, because even though some of these processes, let's say some of these historical processes lead to similar social effects, not always this is the case. And there's something very specific about fleeing from war, for example. And I worked a lot with this. So yes, I think it's important for us to deconstruct it. Roberta, I agree 100%. We can never take our eyes out of this construction, but it's also important for us to never take our eyes out of what is specific in from one place and the other, one kind of phenomenon that you're analyzing in the other. And those sometimes are not distinct in terms of because of kind or gender. They're distinct simply because of a matter of intensity of how violent, let's say, this forced migration is. So I hope that I have started to problematize a little bit that question, and it's something that I hope we can explore perhaps in Vienna or in Trieste or another time a little bit more in depth, because it's certainly a very important question. As to the second question, that's also very much important. I'm glad that you gave me the opportunity to talk a little bit more about it. But when I remember reading, for example, people that like Michel Agier, right, some of the classics of the anthropology of forced migration, and I wrote about 50 pages long article that is just a criticism of that theory, not of Agamben himself, but of how Michel Agier uses Agamben, and how every single anthropologist in the world uses Agamben through Agier instead of using Agamben through Agamben. And to me, that's unfathomable, because Agamben, whenever he talks about refugee camps, and by the way, he talks about refugee camps and concentration camps, which is already not the same. But when he talks about that, of course, he has some other idea in mind. He has the idea of the sovereign and how the sovereign, so the top and the bottom of society are sort of not exactly under the rule of law, and how then the sovereign is sort of resembles the structure of the sovereign, it resembles that of the refugee, and then the state of exception is something that is always looming on the background. And whenever we deal with the conception of the nation state as a whole, he's not creating a tool for us to go there and analyze refugee camps. He's saying, look, these kinds of things are more clear when we see things like refugee camps, but they exist all the time. They're a feature of the nation state. And I simply cannot understand how people don't read Agamben that way. And it's just because they read it through Agier. What I'm trying to get there is like this. When Agier writes about refugee camps, he has in mind the visits that he has. I mean, I enjoy a lot reading Agier. Please don't get me wrong. There's lots of things that are super insightful. But there's one thing that I never accepted which is how he uses his conception of bare life and so on, that is both from Agamben and Hannah Arendt and so on and so forth, because that is something that I could never see. He has in mind this gigantic, more than 100,000 people refugee camps that he sees in Africa that are super mixed in terms of all kinds of ethnicities and groups and nationhoods and whatever and so on and so forth. And he goes and passing these camps. He goes there and he spends like a little bit of time, and he goes. He doesn't leave like I did for like 2 years and straight in refugee camps. And so he doesn't see any agency. He doesn't see any resistance. He doesn't see anything. He only sees bare life, And I couldn't see something not what I saw was could not be further from the truth. This could not be further from the truth. Whenever you deal with Palestinian refugees, and you live in Palestinian refugee camps, and you have military hymns, and you have like military parades or social parades and flags and symbols every single week, sometimes many times a day, like music from the political party offices and the social movement and so on, like reinforcing Palestinianness and the right of return and I don't know what and so on and so forth. You can just think, how is that anybody could think that even that agency, but not only agents, that even people's conceptions of themselves is something that is primarily defined by the UN or by humanitarianism or by the oops, I think my internet is about to fall, as you can see. You see me in the dark. Hopefully the internet is still up for some reason. Anyway, you get my point, I guess, and I hope that there's a lot to see. I think that this space that it's a miracle. There's no electricity, but there's internet. That is between the nation state and the humanitarian order of the world and so on and so forth. That is the major space. That is where most things happen, and especially how most refugees conceive themselves. Isn't Abraço Cultural in Brazil? It's how, you know, the grassroots social organizations, how people get attached. Helena Manfrinato has been working beautifully with this. How, for example, the movement of the land, like the homeless and the landless people, the urban landless people in Brazil, get somehow related to the same agenda as Palestinian refugees coming from the Syrian conflict. How that mobilized them together to create another synthesis of another space for agency and so on and so forth. So yeah, that is the most important space, and I'm very happy that you highlight that, Roberta. Thank you for your questions.
You're muted, Roberto.
Thank you. It's really deep and rich, your presentation. So I hope that we'll see, maybe in Trieste, I invite you to discuss together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Viola, and thank you, Helena, for the invitation. Bye-bye.
So we continue also because the timing is important as always in this kind of events. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Giuliana Sanò. She's postdoc fellow at the Department of Cognitive Science, Psychology, Education, and Cultural Study at the University of Messina, and she will present her paper titled Navigating Immobility, Migrants' Paths in the Post-Reception Period. The floor is yours, Giuliana.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah, I guess you hear me. Okay, perfect. So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. Everyone, thanks Viola and Elena for this invitation. Thanks to our organizer and participants. So let me share, the screen. Share the screen. Perfect. Okay. Okay. Okay, I think now it's good. Okay, perfect. So, today I will start my presentation using a short extract from a conversation I had last year with an asylum seeker who has been in Italy since 2011. His name is Seku, and he comes from Ivory Coast. I think this short extract can offer the meaning, the sense of this presentation better than any other introduction. So, for me, it's not Saturday or Sunday. For me, all days are the same. I do nothing all day long. I'm stuck. I don't move. What does that mean? It means that usually one grows in life, goes up, but instead of going up, I go down. How do you say? First, you have a bicycle, then a scooter, and finally a car. On the other hand, I'm on foot. In fact, I'm going back. I had papers and permanent job. I had everything. Then for something I didn't even do, they took it all away from me. So focusing on ethnographic material as the one I have just reported, in which feeling stuck because of immobility produced by Italian migration policies is well expressed, narrated. This presentation aims to investigate the immobility experienced by migrants and asylum seekers in southern Italy, mostly in Sicily and Calabria. That is where I conducted my fieldwork between 2019 and 2020, based on temporal, spatial, and existential perspective. In particular, through this contribution, I intend to explore how the geographical and biographical trajectory of asylum seekers and migrants who arrived in Italy in the last decade have been affected by new mobility regimes and by the politics of time. With the notion of mobility, or rather immobility regimes, in particular, I refer to the change that have taken place first since 2011 with the so-called North African emergency related to the Arab Springs, and then since 2013 with the beginning of the so-called refugee crisis. Since then, when every form of regularization previously provided by Italian law for non-EU foreign workers ceased, migrants have been forced to regularize their status upon arrival by applying for asylum. This has generated two fundamental changes. First, it has resulted in the transformation of all migrants into asylum seekers. Secondly, it has led to a shift in the border regime, which has been extended inwards and multiplied through the implementation of different types of project and reception facility beyond the physical border. So in mapping these immobility trajectories of migrants and asylum seekers, I in particular question the interval represented by the end of institutional reception for migrants, because I see this moment not only as a time of waiting, but also as revealing the processes of future making. Why this moment? Since the main task of reception is, or should be, assist people in their search for autonomy, the post-reception period is full of expectation, but also fear for the future. It is a crucial moment for migrants, comparable to the beginning of a new existence. Focusing on this moment, I also investigate migrants' emotional and practical response toward the future, looking jointly at their desire for mobility, but also at the territorial specificity of the social network that they can rely on. The capability of imagining possible future is tested by condition of existential precariousness in which migrants are immersed. For this reason, this possibility often requires the collaboration of local social networks to become effective. How the practice needs to be researched along with the creation of new forms of community and network of activism and solidarity. This practice involves, in particular, individuals and their capacity to aspire. I therefore wondered whether in the circumstance where the work of a local social network is not sufficient, the desire, aspiration, and hopes of individuals can instead become significant in the processes of imagining and shaping other possible future. Referring to Van Gennep, some scholars...
Sorry, Juliana, sorry. They're telling me that your slides are not moving. Can you...
Sorry?
Check that, like, that your slides are not, they're not changing.
Okay, maybe because they have not. That is, they not change.
I will see just the first one.
Wow.
Maybe exit from the full screen and then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now it's working. Sorry to interrupt.
No. Thanks. But now, do you see this?
Yes. Now we see a different slides.
Okay.
So
perfect. Sorry so much. So I was saying the capability of imagining possible future is tested by the condition of socioeconomic crisis and existential precariousness in which migrants are immersed. For this reason, this possibility often requires the collaboration of local social networks. So I therefore wondered whether in the circumstance where the work of a local social network is not sufficient, the desired aspiration and hopes of individuals can instead become significant in the processes of imagining and shaping other possible future. Referring to Van Gennep, some scholars have described the migrant's life experience as a rite of passage, with entry into the country of arrival as being read in terms of rebirth. However, the inclusion of migrants into the reception system has changed the course of each individual migration project. It has meant that the moment of rebirth now coincides with the moment when migrants leave the reception system. This temporal delay of the migrants' autonomy, spatially identified in the reception center, is well represented by the mechanism of infantilization and by the practice of resistance to it. Instead of facilitating the expected transition to autonomy, migrants' experience with the Italian reception system leads to a different state of dependency. Some metaphor in this regard and semantically connected to the childhood came out in my fieldwork evidence. Some reception operators stated that guests find it difficult to detach themselves from the umbilical cord. On the other hand, some former residents declared that they would never return to live in a center because for them it would mean going back to drinking milk like children. In focusing on this specific space-time segment represented by the inclusion of migrants into the local socio-economic fabric, I realized that in most cases this passage is configured as a limbo or a protracted present future. People I came into contact with during fieldwork showed the characteristic of subject in transit or in motion, immersed in a condition of suspension caused by a new mobility regime that forces them to enter the reception system and to live with other people without necessarily providing for their social inclusion in the country of destination. This point is directly linked to the question of what kind of network are operating in contemporary migration process. A long-lasting thread of social anthropological research has been dedicated to analyzing the key function of kinship ties, migratory chains, community and neighborhood solidarities, and religious groups in planning and performing mobility, in providing housing and work. The new mobility regimes challenges the classic role of a social network in structuring the process of contemporary migration through the processes mentioned at the beginning of the paper, namely refugiation and institutionalization of reception system. So now the state and other agencies take a closer, almost intimate role in the life of migrants. I'm not arguing here that this signals the end of social network, but that it is worth reflecting on what the institutionalization of networks imply and how migrants deal with this change. In this presentation, we focus particularly on two areas of Calabrian territory, the coastal city of Silla San Giovanni and the plain of Gioia Taura. This latter is best known due to the presence of migrant farm workers employed into one of the main agricultural southern districts. And I will focus also on the condition of limbo experienced by migrants in the post-reception period as a particularly revealing moment of practicing the future, making choices of mobility and immobility, reinterpreting to their advantage the characteristic of the local labor market and the social network built during the reception process, or through activating emotional work based on hope. Although we are undoubtedly in debt to the scholar belonging to the mobility turn, the entire range of mobility experiences cannot be solely traced back to this paradigm. In this regard, some scholars have proposed characterizing the idea of mobility in terms of regimes. This latter, in fact, better highlights the multiple aspects underlying the choice to move from one place to another, and diversifies the condition of treatment and multiple forms of conditioning to which those who move are exposed. What constantly emerged from the field of migration study is that mobility and immobility are not thought of in a binary term, but are intertwined in that the logical of one is always present in the other. Nevertheless, the analytical framework of immobility has been complicated by the attention towards the category of time also. In the specific field of migration, the analytical lens of time has been adopted to investigate multiple themes. First, the hegemonic role of time in the movement of acceleration and stasis that take place in border areas, the uncertainty produced by waiting inside detention center, and different forms of illegality in the existence of those migrants kept at the margin of the arrival societies. In regard to our object of study, the protracted uncertainty or permanent temporariness reported by migrants and refugees seems to be particularly appropriated to our context of analysis, where subjects are constantly exposed to a spatial and temporal uncertainty, provoked by waiting for documents or not being able to enter the labor and housing market. The condition of liminality experienced by migrants can be read in terms of ambivalence related to the indeterminacy of the future, the role played by aspiration, and the way in which spatio-temporal immobility provokes the constant oscillation between hope and depression. For instance, visiting the legal desk coordinated by a group of unionists in the plain of Gioia Tauro, I have been aware of the symptoms of depression embodied in the attitude of those migrants who spent the entire morning sitting, never lifting their eyes from the ground and holding their heads in the hand. Instead, the symptoms of hope never appeared clear to me. Putting into practice what Miyazaki called temporal reorientation of knowledge that reopens the possibility of a good future, I identify the work of hope in this situation of endless waiting and uncertainty. So, with regard to the presence of migrants, there are differences between the two contexts of analysis, Villa San Giovanni and the plain of Gioia Tauro. If internal mobility trajectories in Gioia Tauro is configured as a secondary labor destination due to the limits of access within more qualified sector, for migrants coming from the central Mediterranean route, Villa San Giovanni represents an arrival destination. In addition, due to the existence of a very active reception project, the city also becomes a place of residence for many migrants. So let's go. One of the future of the informal encampments that's for migrants is certainly that of waiting. In almost of all these cases, waiting corresponds to the moment before crossing a border or passing from one European country to another. However, there can often be exceptions, as in the case of the San Ferdinando tent city, the tent city you before saw in the slide. Other factors here determine the experience of waiting, namely the possibility of renewing their documents or the expectation of a temporary inclusion into the agricultural labor market. The ways of reacting to this form of waiting are not unique. On the contrary, they can give rise to a continuum of action and tactics, from protest against the choice to undertake housing and work paths corresponding with one's legal administrative possibility, to a choice that considers the idea of a temporary suspension of one's existence through waiting. This latter choice leaves room for action in which personal subjectivity is fundamental. Indeed, deciding to do nothing, to wait, is not necessarily synonymous with non-action. Such a decision may indicate that people find it more convenient to act differently or to wait for more favorable conditions, as we can see in the case of Gian, a young Malian man. I'm not leaving now. I'm waiting to leave this place, to start living. What do you mean? Every day when I wake up, I go outside and see tents all around me, referring to the tent city. I only see tents and nothing else. Do you think this means living? No, this is not living. Right now, I'm not living. I will start living when I wake up in the morning and see no more tents around me. After living for several years in a city in northern Italy, first in a reception center, then working as a laborer in a factory extracting and processing bergamot juice, Gian decided to leave the city in the north and reach south. Despite my insistence, Gian did not want to dwell on the reason for this decision. He said that it was a long story that he preferred not talked about. Although Gian tried his best to evade my question, some passages in his story suggested that all those years in Italy had, in a sense, prompted him to take a journey backwards, And this was not only because he had moved from working in a factory to the countryside, and therefore from a more qualified job to a less qualified one, but also because the bergamot which he worked on and packaged for large-scale distribution in the north was one of the products most widely grown in Calabria, his new destination. Talking about his current living condition, Jean attributed to his existence a connotation of extreme transience, mainly due to the temporary and precarious nature of the tent in which he lives. The fact that Jean's current material condition could in no way be considered worthy of a real life reminds us of what has already been said about the condition of rebirth that awaits those who leave the reception system. In this regard, Jean's case appears emblematic of existential immobility experienced by migrants and of the continuous oscillation that characterize their lives, suspended between moments of discouragement and moments of hope. But another point lies in the fact that existential immobility is not necessarily linked to a factor of spatial immobility, but rather to the dynamics that shorten or prolong the waiting time in limbo situation. But no less important, though not so evident and clear to catch, as I have already said, is Jean's attitude toward his current living condition, in relation to which he seems to be doing nothing. However, this explains my earlier point that non-action can assume the role of a tactic, interpreted here as the capability of Jean to practice his future while standing still. I'm Bangladeshi and arrived 5 years ago. I have been living in Italy for 5 years and 3 months now. I'm counting the days because I haven't got any documents yet. I spent 5 years in reception. I have always been happy here, only for the documents. Only for that they didn't help me very much. Now I'm working in another project in Calabria as a cultural mediator. Chandan is one of the few Bangladeshis living in Villa San Giovanni. My interest in this case arose from a conversation I had with an operator of the project where Chandan had lived before security decrees forced him to leave the center. Giulio, the operator, had spoken of Chandan's case as a particularly virtuous one, not only because once he had left the project, he had managed to find accommodation in Villa San Giovanni, but also because his work project differed from the usual job reserved for migrants in the local and national labor market. In fact, asked about the reason why he had stayed in Villa San Giovanni, he replied, "Here there is some work to do. Even as a private person, I work as a computer technician. As I know many people in Villa San Giovanni, I stayed here. The work I did in Bangladesh was in IT. Now I would like to open a shop." I did a search on internet and saw that there is no competition here. There are no other people working in this sector. There is one, but I don't think it does everything. We technicians, some technicians only work to change screen, board. Some technicians also work on the board, changing small components using microscopes. And here they don't do these things, whereas I can do them. Chandan's weight is therefore only linked to his legal position on which his new existence in Italy depends. While Jean's rebirth will coincide with the moment he leaves his stand, Chandan's rebirth will only occur once he obtains his document. Until then, it is impossible for either of them to consider themselves to be truly alive. Nevertheless, in Chandan's life trajectory, the opportunity to put his skills and work experience into practice has certainly made a difference. His staying in the town of Villa San Giovanni has nothing to do with the limbo and immobility situation of most of people I've met in the plain of Gioia Tauro. In this case, the institutionalized social network constituted by the accompanying work and socio-occupational integration carried out by operators of the reception center have allowed him to become familiar with the local context and to carve out space of autonomy and creativity. In fact, in addition to his work as a cultural mediator, he also managed to put his IT skills to good use, making a space for himself within a particular sector of the labor market usually inaccessible to migrants. So focusing on the time period of post-reception as a moment and type of post-displacement has allowed me to look at immobility of migrants and asylum seekers from a new perspective. Ethnographic observation of migrant experience after the reception period allows me to reflect jointly on spatial trajectory, processes of future making, and the role of the social network. When migrants leave the reception system, their geographical and biographical trajectory become a litmus test of mobility regimes, time, politics, and tactics used by individuals to navigate the regime of space-time suspension in which they are immersed. In doing so, we have identified that the post-displacement condition is composed of multiple time-space runs, and among them, liminality and limbo is fundamental. Comparing the two territorial contexts, we have discovered that these dynamics are synchronized with the temporalities that cross the local labor and housing markets. They give rise, in fact, to a different ways of thinking about and living the future, putting hope to work as a way of escaping from awaiting or finding ways of making space for oneself by putting one's knowledge, relationship, skill to use. Finally, social networks continue to be fundamental for migrants, even the new mobility regime. What characterizes the nature of this network is the fact that they now coincide with the role of mediator exercised by reception operators. The traditional role of a social network seems to be reduced by the passage of migrants within the meshes of the institutionalized reception system. So specific social networks emerge, which also extend to those activated by the relationship between migrants, territories, and socioeconomic actors in the processes of arrival, transit, and residence. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Juliana, for your presentation. That's very interesting. Now I give the floor to the last speaker of the seminar, Osvaldo Constantini, from the University of Messina. He is gonna present the paper, The Humanitarian Between Depolitization and Capitalist Accumulation. Osvaldo, the floor is yours. You're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation. Thank you, Viola and Helena, for the organization. Today, I will present a mix of my ethnographic fields that are one period of almost 9 months in working in an hotspot and 1 year working in reception centers, and some other experience I will mix together. And the final aim is to discuss the intertwining between humanitarian approach and the way of and the new ways of capital accumulation. I partially take ideas from Miguel Mellino, critical reading of Fascin's book, The Humanitarian Reason. We can resume his critic, but I will go back on it, in the idea that Fascin does not take into account the humanitarian as one of the way of capital accumulation and of society's hierarchization. There are anyway some assumption at the basis of this paper that I will try also to demonstrate and to go back on it during the speech. The first one is a general question that, in my opinion, represents an important reminder. I want to put the analysis of both humanitarian system and general reception system within a class framework. Sometimes social scientists forget what historians know very well, that under the capitalist regime, the movement of poor people, across borders, has always something to do with the creation of labor force. As Fascin himself reminds, also the refugee issue after the Second World War had to be with an European need of labor force. Unfortunately, Fasten does not go deeper in the issue and does not trace the right conclusions of his reflection, in my opinion. An Italian historian, or maybe an Italian sociologist like Paolo Cinanni, argued that in the 70s, refugees from Eastern Europe, migration from former colonies, and Italian migration, especially from southern Italy, were phenomena to understand also, and maybe first of all, in the framework of Central European labor market needs. And the second assumption I would like to anticipate here is about the notion of extractive capitalism forged by Saskia Sassen, but I rearrange a little bit. I intend it as a main notion to read humanitarianism as a government technique completely internal to the neoliberal mode of accumulation and to extractive patterns, understood as the ability to extract value from territories, cities, relationship, and desires. Usually, as those usually I prefer to use long and single ethnography, of course, instead of endless theoretical speculation. But today, as I told you before, I'll try to use more than one fieldwork, because I think that after many years, maybe 20 years of research about refugees and asylum seekers, we can try to draw some lines of conclusion or maybe links between situations. Anyway, the first thing I want to show off is that we can call the precarization of the status, of the legal status. In Italian is precarizzazione degli status. I'm not so sure that in English precarization exists, but I think we can understand what I mean. In this process, humanitarian plays an important, main, and pivotal role because when the approach has shifted to humanitarian protection, that means not to recognize people as a hero in looking for freedom, and not as asylum seekers, not as refugees in the very sense of the legal category, but with many different national categories, like the humanitarian rule in France and the Italian in Italy from 2007, the humanitarian protection. We can see some dynamics in these processes, very interesting in the sense of precarization of the status. Because, for example, the fact that after 2007, the humanitarian protection is the most important in quantitative terms in the reception system, it means that people are recognized more as under the humanitarian categories, under the humanitarian protection, rather than into the refugee and the international protection or subsidiary protection. This was clear that maybe everyone know, but it's important to repeat and to remind, humanitarian protection was a minor protection. It means that humanitarian protection was of 1 year. After some years became 2 years, with many difficulties to renew it, because the condition, the physical condition or the psychological condition or the general condition that brought to recognize one under the humanitarian category could finish, and so the permit to stay finished, and many people were forced to transform it in work permits, accepting everything the landlords or the entrepreneurs gave them. So the precarity of the precariousness of the humanitarian category was, first of all, in my opinion, connected with the need of creating a new uncertain and temporary and precarious labor force. That is maybe a sociological reading, but we can use the ethnographies and the anthropological approach also to make it rich. Humanitarian precarization of status reminds us that what Black Marxism critiques to the white Marxism, so that one of the main force of the capital has not been transforming the mass of people in a single mass of workers, but it works creating different categories of people that compose an heterogeneous worker class. That is the reason why many social scientists and philosophers speak about the racial supplement of capitalism. If this explanation made me I think it convinced me. I think that we can understand in a new sense what Fascines describes, what Fascines and many other scientists, of course, describes as the shift from of the image of the asylum seekers from a hero looking for freedom because of the need of workers, as Fascine himself argues, to a parasite who wanted to take advantage of Western opportunities and welfare, and or a victim to taking care because of her physical or mental sufferings. We can try to understand the connection between this cultural construction and the new needs of neoliberal capitalism. But the issue of victimization of refugees brings us to the second point I want to show off, that is the humanitarian system of reception, because as the literature widely underlined, the European reception system and the Italian reception system as part of it has been characterized by a military approach with the large use of repression, surveillance, and control. Moreover, the reception patterns based on the reception centers in Italy are SPRAR, CAS, and with other names, but all the same, has been understood as places where taking in care is intertwined with control and discipline of moving bodies. Before going deeper in this argument, I would like also to remind that the centers themselves fit with an extractive logic. Even though the rhetoric of reception business, il business dell'accoglienza, has been used also by right-wing movements, nobody can deny that the network of so-called cooperatives extract from social group and from power relationships between them different surplus value. In economic terms, they simply gain money sparring on services, workers, and structures. Public money become private wealth. Moreover, it creates job and then fuel the patronage relationships so spread within society like the Italian one, as maybe most of you know. But they play another important role in the neoliberal society. They leave autonomy to people. That is as Juliana told us before, more or less, that is the main strategy of capitalism more than other system, in the sense of maybe we can go back to the notion of separating people from the means of life reproduction. Here, it is again important, the category of victim. Refugee is someone to taking care, to cure from bad past, with all the trauma rhetoric that becomes the only element for his or social recognition. This leads to two behaviors. What we offer them, as Vacchiano reminds, is always better than they had in the past. And so they have to be grateful and non-critical. Asylum seekers who protest for food, for example, represented a sort of cultural scandal in the Italian public debate. The second behavior stems from the first one, the need of good life. And the future is totally denied by an humanitarian approach that pretends to save and cure people. Taking in care means, at least in Italy, putting people in buildings where their agency is strongly limited. Here I will go to my various ethnographic experience, even though I will mix them. Living in reception centers, as I could see, means that one has to respect some schedules, to go back in the night, go out in the morning, eating. Moreover, people can cook their food most of the times, but they should eat what a catering service makes for them. People are in shared rooms with no privacy, with no opportunity to invite friends or sexual partners. And as Juliana reminded us before, with many strategy of infantilization, like for example, calling the pocket money paghetta, so the little money you give to children, paghetta, I don't know how to translate perfectly. If people want to stay out for the night, they have to communicate it, and it can be more than 3 nights. Otherwise, they can lose their right to receptions. So reception is like an opportunity for people, but also a constriction for people, because there are no other ways to live. Obliging people to stay in the structure is part of that dynamic we can call governing everything. That is a typical neoliberal construction that seems to be a non-neutral structure from a class framework. It helps in the accumulation of private capital, as we saw before. For example, the humanitarian approach we can see also in another case I would like to show now, that is very short, because after the ethnography in the reception centers, I also made an experience in migrants and refugees or asylum seekers squats in Rome. When they find this autonomous way to shelter by occupying building, for example, with local movement for the right of dwelling, spending on the rent and the bills price, and of course obtaining shelter by themselves, first of all, they have to fight against an act made by Renzi Lupi in 2014 that deny to people living in the squats to sign in the National Sanitarian Service, electoral list, and some other rights, among which also the opening, renewing of the residence permit and the discount on public transportation. Moreover, when evictions happen, public institutions do not leave people on the street, of course, but in the name of humanitarian ideas, host people in private residences that costs to the municipality around 560 and 70 euros for each person per month. So big money that come from public, because municipality is public administration, to private actors. And within this particular dynamic, we can find again the losing of autonomy of people. Juliana underlined this point a lot of times in her speech, because they can't cook for themselves again. Families live with other families. In some cases, people told me Muslim families are in trouble because a man cannot stay alone in an house with a woman without her husband. So people with different job schedules have to go out together, losing a lot of times, of course. So losing autonomy, is intertwined in this case with the discipline of workers to subalternity, and all the Italian case can demonstrate that. For example, I would like to jump to another place of the country, but underlining the same dynamic: living autonomy and using humanitarian as a form of constriction to stay where they have to stay, so they can't move by themselves and so on. I think I have 5 minutes. Viola.
Yeah, actually, that was a few minutes ago, but no, you still have like 3-4 minutes.
3-4 minutes. Okay. I will refer to Ventimiglia. That is an important point of transit of migrants from Italy to France. And here we can see another particular strategy. People who wanted to leave autonomously to France or to other European countries met a very strong opposition by France because of the declaration of the emergency state of emergency. In 2016. They used it to pushing migrants back. But I don't want to go deeper in the France dynamic. I would like to analyze the Italian side, because when people were pushed back from France, the Italian police used to take them and to bring them in Taranto. That is 1,200 kilometers to the south, so it's very distant. But for an police identification, that they could be on the spot in Ventimiglia or around Ventimiglia, in Imperia, in the first questura they wanted. So in this dynamic, we can see two things. First of all, that the transportation of people from Ventimiglia to Taranto, that was really crazy in logic and bureaucratic terms, had a big cost. It cost like 5,000 euro. More the expenses for the police, so it's like 10,000 euro for each travel. And I calculate that in 2016, from 2016 up to 2017, the costs of travel were like 1 million euro. Now 1 million euro. That a big part of that was gained by the company who that was responsible for the transport, the Riviera Transport, if I don't mind. Anyway, the second stuff that is important to understand is that in Taranto, often people were forced to go back to their place, like Bologna or Milano, where they had the place in reception centers. But they had to go by their expenses. So it means people should pay again. In some cases, in many cases, to be honest, but I don't want to take now the single cases. Many people went to work in the farms to gain again the money to go back in their places, or to try again the way of Ventimiglia. And many women we saw going and falling in the network of prostitution, for example. So it's a lot of intertwined dynamics that seems to have in common the outcome of pushing people in self-exploitment or in exploitment or like that. Finally, in conclusion, I would like to reflect on Melino's statement about the humanitarian reason of Fassen. And Mellino made the theoretical proposal to read the necropolitical dimension as a costitutive reverse, rovescio costitutivo in Italian, of the neoliberal technologies of government, and not a simple addiction, exception, or supplement. He says more directly, what I propose is to think about the process of arranging citizenship into hierarchy at the basis of the current neoliberal logic of capitalist accumulation, starting from this double government device, biopolitical, necropolitical, in which the putting to work of life, the production of freedom, competition, self-entrepreneurship of a part of the population is not only intrinsically connected, but it appears wholly dependent on segregation, terror, discipline, inferiorization, servile exploitation, incarceration, and death, physical and social, of another. Racism, policies, and institutional racist violence, securitarianism, the militarization of territories and borders, the logic of reproduction of the camps, the development of the so-called neoliberal penal and punitive state, the urban segregation are not simply something externally, secondary, residually, or a sovereign limit of neoliberal governmentality, but social enhancement devices at the very core of this technology of government. In my opinion, we can see we know Mellino is nice theoretical, but he doesn't propose any ethnographic data. But when we go on the ethnographic fieldwork, on our fieldwork, we can see some of the idea he showed off in criticizing Fassin, when, for example, we, as I told you before, can find the common point of all the dynamics in living autonomy, producing precariousness, pushing people in the exploitation in many ways, or disciplinating people to a life without autonomy, so in a subaltern life. That is, I want to try to arrange today by mixing some ethnographical data in this framework. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Osvaldo. And now I will call Roberta Altin to pose her question for Giuliana and Osvaldo.
Thank you, Giuliana. Thank you, Osvaldo. Very rich presentations. Seems to me that we are playing between this category of asylum seekers versus economic migrants, and then we have to discuss the geographical and the temporal categories. There, as Osvaldo said, are intertwined, and we have to focus our discussion on the mobility and the forced immobility of migrants. So very briefly, because we don't have enough time, I would like to ask to Giuliana, so your speech has perfectly underlined this immobility, the suspended time of migrants that are stuck in transit. You know, that is my favorite focus in research. So this time of waiting, as well described by Khosravi, the migrant is always waiting. So this time is something in your presentation useful and sometimes necessary for the development of the agency of asylum seeker in this liminal phase, and sometimes is a kind of tools to make the migrants more passive and docile, and more adapt to create cheap labor force, as Osvaldo said in the second presentation. So I want to ask you, when, in your opinion and your experience, because you have many fields in North and South Italy, and not only that, when and under what conditions waiting becomes for asylum seeker or migrant an agency? And does it depend from the different transit phases, for example, the beginning or the final phases? or different reception structure, shelter or a military center, this kind of thing. So very briefly. And for Osvaldo, you have applied a wider analysis with a framework of European perspective, no, in order to understand how this process of reception of asylum seeker is functional to create new categories of poor people without right, labor force. When this migration process becomes a kind of filter process for the construction of new kind of slavery, if you want to use the colonial approach of Mellino and other scholars. So your analysis underlined the necessity to use the notion of extractive capitalism. You use Saskia Sassen or other sociologists in order to understand the neoliberal governmentally. So I am not totally agree with your critique against Fassem, because I think the most of your attack is very similar to the book of Humanitarian Reason, is a text that is against the humanitarian reason, and I read many similarity of your thought and the thought of Mellino also in the book of Fassem, but probably is a different approach. Anyway, my question is, don't you think that these categories from a Marxist approach are maybe too abstract and distant from the concrete existential experience of migrants, considering also the different temporal regime that Juliana well described? So don't you think that we are in risk to put another abstract theoretical approach in order to understand the historical situation? Because in your presentation you very clear explain also the historical reason, and we have to take in account this. Maybe Juliana.
Okay, I will start. Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Roberta, for your question. So I guess that the possibility that waiting became a sorry, Osvaldo, can you unmute your microphone? Okay, thank you, sorry. So first of all, sorry about this slide before, very sorry, forgive me. So I guess that the possibility that the waiting dimension, let's say, becoming a favorable condition arises in, of course, in relation to, as I observed in all of this year in which I conducted my research field work, in relation to the territories. For example, why I decide to offer you this short picture of migrant workforce employed into the agricultural sector, because this sector can be seen from the side of course, exploitation, as Osvaldo explained very well before during his speech. And of course, it's like that. But on the other hand, I think that we can see also to some sector and to some place and territories, like the one of Rosarno in southern Italy, in Calabria, as a place where people can find, let's say, shelter, but I don't think it's really a shelter, but a possibility to, for example, wait for moving elsewhere. But in that place, they can be wait without being necessarily, controlled by local police force or police, by the local police, but they can also go in there because it's more simple for them renewing their document. So what I really wanted to do through this presentation and contribution is show the existential dimension and more than spatial and temporal dimension that of course are overstudied, I mean. And I want to give you a particular segment of the category of mobility, of mobility regimes, what appunto Schiller and Salazar called mobility regimes, just because I think that more than temporal, of course, and spatial time, space and time dimension that are, of course, really important and crucial and significant in what we call mobility regimes or new politics of time. I think that another dimension that we have to look at is, of course, the one of existential dimension that is related to the personal condition, so the oscillation between discouragement and hope and desire and aspiration, okay? Then is related to the territory, of course. For example, is not maybe many people looking at the Italian context, they think that North, since it's a wealth territory, rich territory where the economy and is of course different from the South, there is a gap from the North to the South. Many people think that for migrants, North is of course better than the South. But looking at the narratives or looking at the life experience or trajectory, geographical trajectory of migrants, we can see also that often the South territory, the Southern Italy, is better than the North. So, and it implies, of course, that in the Southern context, they have, for example, wait for inclusion into the labor market, wait for inclusion into the housing market. But once they rely on this kind of support, thanks to the social operators, social workers, and the networks they have in this territory, life is better than, for example, in the North. I had no time and space for reporting the difference between the North and the South, well depicted and narrated by one of the operators I interviewed in the North, in Trento. But for example, one of these operators said to me when I was doing my fieldwork in the North, he said to me, okay, people after they leave the reception center in the North, in Trento, they prefer to reach the South. Well, because the informality, let's say illegality, is more, is said sustainable, but it's like it is absolved by the local authority. Okay, so instead, when I came back to the South for my new research project, and I started my investigation in the Southern and into the agricultural labor sector and market in Calabria, the operator, the unionists, the trade unionists, they told me, it's not true. Many people here have the document, okay, have the document. They are not illegal. So it's a kind of talking about stereotype and rhetorics towards migrants, towards Southern, for example, Southern Italy. I think that this kind of research and ethnographic encounter or experience from which I have learned that the common sense is what we have to, I mean, in a word, deconstruct. And the category of waiting, just because it's really linked to existential dimension and the subjectivity that is fundamental in the choice of mobility or immobility of the people, is one of the best ways for deconstructing this kind of stereotype or common sense on migrants and territory as well. Sorry. Hi.
So, thank you for the questions, Roberta. On the first question, I think it's my fault. I think that Fassen analysis, Fassen book, humanitarian is a masterpiece. Okay, I just see that it doesn't go deeper in a conclusion. That's my point of view to understand economic logic and systemic logic behind the humanitarian reason. First of all, secondly, on the second question, for example, about the distance between our categories and reality, I answer with a question, and I do it because of the short time. It's not a provocatory answer. I think all our categories are a little bit abstract and distant from the reality, if I correct understood your question, because my connection is like 5 seconds of stop and I jump somewhat. I think, for example, that all the big and wide use of Foucault in everything is really sometimes distant from the daily life and the real life. Sometimes I read some Foucaultian reading of something, and there is a big description of how the power function, where is biopower, but I don't find who is the power and who take advantage of some situation. I don't know if you can share with me this idea. I went back to not to a Marxism approach. I used a notion that is stressed also by David Harvey, for example, the notion of spoliation in English, I think it is, spoliazione. For example, Harvey says some ways of recognition and denying people of obliging people to some categories, like a spoliation of subjectivity itself. I went back to that Marxist concept, maybe in a new shape, of course, that reminds us that the first point of the separation of people, of groups, is and concerns the separation of people from the means of the reproduction of life. That means I have to work or to do something to continue living, and in that we can read some dynamics of the reception. For example, living autonomy. When I say living autonomy, is a typical capitalist way of obliging people to do something and then to commodify their labor force or everything, and etc. Maybe the answer should be really longer than this, and we can debate for 3 or 4 days with no stop. But I think the advantage of that using of that category, for example, I'm surprised of your question. I will think about it. Is that, in my opinion, is not an abstraction of the daily life. Is nearest than some other categories. For example, it's not so distant. If I okay, in our bad English, in my Italian bad English, but if I speak with a migrant with this category, maybe he can understand and he can dialogue with me better than a big and Agambenian or Foucaultian approach.
I totally agree with you. If I may, my advice is to read again Fassin, because the concept of inequality in Fassin is a denounce of the same attack that you using Sassen or other or David Harvey are try to understand the situation now in Europe for asylum seeker. So my advice was not to use another rigid paradigm, because I think that we need a multiscalar approach in order to understand the intertwining of this process. It's very complicated and heterogeneous. So in order not to have only rigid categories of understanding, I think that at this moment we need an historical approach, and this means that we have to use different approach, and probably also Didier Fassin could be a good author if you read not in a dichotomy is good or not good, you know. So this is my advice, but I am an expert in migration and not in Marxism and capitalism. So I have a different approach, and so probably my literature and bibliography has more with
if
the
I can,
yeah.
for example, I appreciate about Fassin. If you read an Italian, and I don't remember if Paolo Cinanni was an historian or sociologist, but for example, he analyzes all in the 60s and in 70s, all the juridical categories Switzerland used to push Italians to work for them and to be minacciabili, ricattabili, and it's very interesting because it reminds us Fassin, of course, because, for example, he plays around the notion of protection and so on, but it reminds us an aspect that maybe I lost in Fassin, as you say, that is more attached to the capital accumulation or whatever is the category we want to use.
Yes, but I think that the Fassin is their experience as a doctor come from another field. So yeah. He tried to deconstruct and criticize the approach to humanitarian reason and not to the economic labor force and market. And this is another field. So maybe at this moment we need both the approach in order to be more critic against this kind of regime, because it's as you explained and Juliana explained, is a mix. Is a part of humanitarian approach and protection, and at the end we can see the new slavery, because I can see on the board also from Balkan route we have a terrible experiment of new creation of labor force low level without right, especially minor and so on. So this is only advice. So all we are here to discuss together in order to create a new category, because it's really a heterogeneity of a scenario and very complicated. So thank you a lot for your explanation and for your rich presentation. Thank you a lot, Viola, also for this opportunity to share with the Brazil and so amazing situation, different, but with many point of interest, common interest. So thank you a lot.
Yes, thank you to all of you. I think this conversation could go on forever, and I think there are so many interesting points that you touched, both in your presentation and in the discussion. And we really hope that this conversation will continue, and this connection that this seminar just started to create could continue as well. But unfortunately, we already passed like 15 minutes past what it was supposed to be the end of the seminar. So I unfortunately we have to close it. But so thank you again to everybody, and it was really a pleasure. And Ellen, I don't know if you want to thank.
Thank you so much, guys. It was a pleasure. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.
And so, but yeah, let's continue this conversation through other channels. Thank you again to Cebrap for their support, and to Paolo Montero, and yeah. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye.
Ciao. Ciao.